Good afternoon. Welcome to the Charlotte City Council's Budget Workshop number 2. We're glad to have you join. This meeting is being held in the Government Center. It's being held also in accordance with all of the meeting notifications required for electronic communication. But we hope that you're watching on one of our 3 opportunities: YouTube, Facebook, and I guess what's the other one? I can't remember. I guess those 2 options are available. You also want to recognize that we have several council members and a budget office team here to work with us today, and then other council members will join us virtually. And Mr. Jones, should I just go around for all of the staff people, starting with Mr. Cagle, that are at the table to present for us today, and then we'll go to those that are attending virtually. So we'll start with Mr. Cagle.
Yes, good afternoon. Brent Cagle, City Manager's Office.
Teresa Smith, CFO.
Ryan Bergman, Budget Director.
Malcolm Graham, City Council District 2.
Ed Driggs, City Council District 7.
Marcus Jones, City Manager.
Vi Lyles, Mayor.
Billy Tons, Deputy City Clerk.
Marquita Moss, Assistant City Clerk for the minutes.
All right, thank you, everyone. Now we'll go to those that are joining us virtually. We'll start with the Mayor Pro Tem.
Good afternoon, everyone. Julie Eisel, Mayor Pro Tem and serving at large.
Greg Phipps at large.
Mark Eggleston, District 1.
Good afternoon, Renee Johnson, District 4.
Good afternoon, Matt Newton, District 5.
Tar Picard, District 6.
All right, I think, and we have our city attorney.
Patrick Baker, City Attorney.
All right, I think those are the folks that are joining us virtually. Mr. Winston is driving and on his way. I believe that he's listening, and we would prefer that he not be on video right now while he's driving, and so that he can get here safely, but he will be joining us. Today we're going to continue with the second budget workshop based on the schedule that was prepared by the recommendation from the Budget Committee. We will talk about our general capital investment program. We'll talk about our ability to fund and finance capital projects, and most importantly, the council priorities for what projects would be promoted and approved, and the criteria that we have to keep our existing infrastructure strong and well. Just like the last time, this is an open discussion. Put it in the room. Staff will try to answer any questions, but also that if you have a question that perhaps it's just more simple to do it this way, you can take questions or email them to Marie Harris if that works, or if it's something that you want to have a little bit more research on. The questions and answers from the last meeting were emailed to you on Friday, so you should have a hard copy today. And as a reminder, we will have one additional budget workshop on April the 6th, where we talk about technology, also the outlook for cats, water, and aviation. And now I'd like to recognize Ed Driggs, Chair of our Budget Committee, for his comments before turning it over to the City Manager.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll just say briefly that during our committee report outs, I highlighted a couple of discussions that we had in committee related to the steady state affordability and the additional debt capacity that we've identified. In this meeting, we'll need to think about where the most productive uses might be for that, or if the manager has a suggestion, we'll entertain those. And the transportation capital investments, which incorporate possibly a number of urgent needs for those additional funds. But otherwise, I think I covered most of this at the committee report out, and we'll just say the Budget Committee did approve this agenda, and we look forward to the discussion. Thank you, Mayor.
All right, Mr. Jones, all yours with the staff.
Okay, so thank you, Mayor, members of council, Mr. Chair. This is that time of year where we have an opportunity for you to take a deeper dive into our capital improvement program. You know, one of the things I'd like to lead off today with is, I think this is a little bit more, I guess it's unique in the sense that typically over the last, 8 or so years, maybe longer than that, the council has started off with bond cycles based on a tax increase. So in other words, the property tax would go up, and then that would in part help fund the next series of bond cycles, typically 4 bond cycles. What's before you today is something that's unique in the sense that last year, or in this year's budget, we were able to produce for you 4 bond cycles, preliminary bond cycles, with no tax increase. So what that does is it gives you flexibility as we deal with the number of challenges that we have in our community. What we tried to do, again, in the current budget last year, we tried to listen to those things that are important to you and set a foundation for projects that are consistent with what we believe are the council's priorities. That included providing, additional funds as it relates to our sidewalks, additional funds as it relates to Vision Zero, and that's our base, I guess, our starting point, our foundation. Today, you'll get some news in terms of what has changed with our capacity, in other words, our ability to afford projects. I thought that Mr. Driggs did an excellent job Monday night with the committee report out, laying out where we are, and you'll get to see some of that today. What I also want to point out today is that it's not just, the next 4 bond cycles, but it's also what we're trying to do to correct some of the problems that you've faced in the past. One of the things that we joke about, and we shouldn't joke about it, we talk about, let's not have any more cross-Charlotte trails. And the reason that we can say that now is because of the Advanced Planning Fund, where we're able to get projects to a 30% design, much more certainty before we place them in the budget. And you will see some of the offshoots of that hard work. So again, I think we have a superstar lineup in all of Team Charlotte, 8,000 employees. Today we have a segment of that superstar lineup in terms of budget and finance and CDOT and general services. So they'll walk you through where we are. We need more guidance from you, as we always get in these budget workshops. And we are prepared to provide you with as much input and information as you need to make any decisions to help us with next year's budget. So with that said, Mayor, I'd love to turn it over to the team.
Good afternoon. Again, I'm Teresa Smith, CFO, and what I would like to bring for you this afternoon is an update on our steady state affordability. Give the presentation just a second to come up. Just give me a minute here as we work through the technology. There we go. Okay, so just an overview of what we'll talk about today. We'll talk about what is the steady state. We'll do a little bit of a dive into the debt model and some of the key drivers in the model. We'll talk about what the actual updated steady state affordability number is, and then we'll wrap this up with why all of this matters. And I would say that we think about this as setting the stage for the capital planning program, so that you have this information as you go into your conversations about how you allocate funding to projects. So what is the steady state? As has been said, the city uses a comprehensive capital planning program. Debt is one portion of that program. We also look at things like PAYGO and grants and different ways of funding projects. But when we talk about steady state, we're specifically talking about debt and the affordability of that debt. There are 2 types of debt that the city uses for the general capital program. The general obligation bonds, which you'll hear that referred to as GO bonds, and certificates of participation, or COPs. So what is the difference in those? Well, our GO bonds are what we use for housing, transportation, neighborhood improvements. These are the things that have to be approved by the voters, and they're supported by a property tax. Our COPs are what we use for our facilities, whether that's new facilities or renovation of facilities. That does not have to be approved by the voters, and that is supported by a pledge of the asset or collateral, so if you think about your home mortgage. When we talk about affordability, what we're looking at is that the overall debt service through final maturity, however long that is, generally 20 years, that we can afford the debt that we are issuing and that we still maintain our financial policies. One of those examples is that we're maintaining a fund balance in our debt service fund that will be able to meet those debt service requirements. Tell me which way. Okay, yeah, I may do that instead. Okay, so a little bit more information about the steady state. The terminology steady state is something that we introduced in 2018 as a way to look at preserving future affordability. So we're not just looking at what we can afford today, but we're looking over those future bond cycles. Sort of focusing in on that highlighted set of bars there, this is how the steady state has progressed over time. So in 2018, when we first talked about steady state, we were looking at $190 million that was shared between bonds and COPs. When we looked again in 2019, it had moved to $223 million, and then the latest steady state we've talked about is $248 million. This is what we would expect to happen. And I thought Councilmember Driggs did a great job on Monday night as he talked about this, that we use assumptions in our model that are conservative but reasonable, and then we outperform those assumptions. And when we do that, that is what creates the additional affordability. So in the model, we have our assumptions where we're using historical trends or market data, and then as those actuals are known, we'll update with actual results, like from the external audit, or once the budget gets approved, or when we sell debt, or when we actually issue debt, then we'll update the model for those things. So let's talk a little bit about how the affordability was impacted with some specific results, looking at key drivers that are in the debt model. We'll talk about revenues, we'll talk about expenses, and then we'll talk a little bit about interest rates. So when we look at revenues, one of the main revenues for this model is our sales tax. So our FY21 sales tax, we were coming out of COVID, we were trying to figure out the state of the world and what that looked like. So we had an assumption for sales tax. We outperformed that by $5.2 million on our sales tax. So that additional revenue creates additional affordability within the model. When we look at expenses, this is where we talk about realistic expectations for how we will spend on projects. And so it's already been mentioned, the creation of our advanced planning funds that we started in 2019. That is helping us to have a better idea on actual expenses, on the timing of those expenses. So that is helping us from an expense side, and that is making a positive contribution into the affordability. And then on the interest rate component, this is one where we are looking at 20-year debt. And so we are making assumptions about what will interest rates be on that debt as we go forward into the future. Again, we take a conservative look at this, but what we think is reasonable. As an example, in November of 2021, we were in the market for a general obligation refunding. And this is where we were taking our short-term program and converting it to a long-term. We were able to issue that debt at an all-in cost of funds of 1.63%, which is a really great rate. And
Can I send you my mortgage?
Yeah, so, I wanted to say here, part of this was just that we were in the market at a good time. You can never discount that. That part of it just has to do with the market. But the other part of that is that we have a really great team, both internally, which includes the work that you all are doing as a council, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But we also have a great external team, our partners that we work with, our financial advisor, and our consultants that we use. We just have a really great all-around team that helped us to achieve that kind of result. So what you really want to know is what is the new updated steady state affordability. And after we've taken all those things into account, that new number is 37 million. So this will be the amount that you will consider as you start to go into your conversations about how to allocate funding on projects. And why does it matter? So we talk about the AAA rating for the city. The city has a AAA, meaning that from the three major rating agencies, Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch, we have the AAA, which is the highest rating that the rating agencies will provide. What that means to an investor is that it is the highest quality financing instrument with very minimal risk. And that is important when we go into the market and we're able to get those lower interest rates, so our cost of funds are lower because of our AAA rating. Part of the reason we're able to maintain the AAA rating is what we're doing today. The planning process that this council does to look at affordability and to look into the future are what help us maintain that AAA rating. So a lot of words on the screen. I won't read them all, but I will highlight just a couple of things. These are comments that came from rating reports related to that financing that I was just speaking about. So for Moody's, they said that we benefit from formal policies, long-term planning, and conservative budgeting. Standard & Poor's said we have strong financial policies and practices. We annually update capital planning that identifies funding for projects 5 years in advance. And Fitch noted that we have a solid ability to manage our spending pressures associated with growth. All of those very positive comments that highlight what we're doing today. And the last slide that I have for today is just a start for discussion purposes as a way that we look at allocating that 37 million in additional affordability. So later on today, Budget Director Bergman will be talking about ways of using this. And the starting point for that conversation is to put 27 million toward bonds and 10 towards COPS. But again, that is up for discussion for you guys. And with that, I'll stop for questions.
Are there questions from the council? I don't see any on the screen.
Yes, I have a question.
All right. I'm sorry. Ms. Ajmira?
Yes. Thank you, Madam Mayor. So this breakdown of 37, of 27 being the bonds and 10 being the COPS, how does that get decided?
That will be part of the conversation that you all will have today. So again, this is just a starting point. So we wanted to take, what you will see when you get into a later presentation is 225 million that we have started with for bonds, which is taking the current 198 million plus 27. And so this is just a starting point for you guys for conversation.
Yeah, Councilmember Ajmira, the way that this is really decided is by City Council in an actual budget process when you approve it. The starting point for today is based on trying to make sure that we can get the majority of funds towards the bonds because we'll certainly talk about a lot of needs and priorities. But on the COP side, what that 10 million equals is about 5 million more per year. I'll tell you that the biggest pressure that we're facing is in some of the growth plans for our fire stations and fire facilities. And then additionally, there's some technology-related issues that we'll talk about at our next workshop. But that's not a decision. It's just to be able to talk about, to be able to build the slides with, here's capacity, here's some of the needs, here's some of the programs. We just needed a starting point, and so we use this for now.
Got it. So I know that we have $37 million. That's in additional capacity for capital. So that's all bonds, correct? So that $37 million, are all of them could be bonds?
Yes, theoretically, all of them could be bonds, but what we're trying to represent with this slide is that a portion of them, from a recommendation standpoint, would likely be used, at least in the proposed budget, for COPS to take care of some of those facility needs, such as fire station, that we see over the next 5 years.
Fair enough. So I guess I'm just trying to figure out a model where we can use COPS, where the obligation is attached to a specific asset, whether it's a building or an equipment or a heavy fleet. That's when we can use COPS. So does that mean it frees up our other capacity for other things, such as our capital needs, such as sidewalks or bike lanes or pavement?
So, Councilman Ashmere, I'll try to give it a shot. So as Ryan said earlier, ultimately you could use all of this for bonds. When he gets to one of his presentations, he's going to show you some new pressures that we have on, like you just said, those COPS-related projects, that if we didn't reserve some capacity for those projects, we could be in a deficit with some of our buildings and this ERP system that we'll talk about later. But ultimately, if you wanted to use it all for bonds, you could.
Got it. Okay, that explains. So ultimately, our capacity includes both COPS and bonds. So let's say if we were to use it for facility or equipment or any of that, that would count towards our total $37 million capacity.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Mayor Pro Tem?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Ryan, I just have a question on the 37 million excess capacity is in part due to the increase in revenues that were above and beyond what was projected, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. And from that, I guess my question is, how comfortable are you all that that projection is going to be stable? So, I realize that the vast source of our revenue is property tax, but I'm just wondering how many components are in there that have sort of an artificial impact on our budget because of COVID and because of federal funding that either, went to us or went to citizens, individuals. Maybe it has nothing to do with property tax, but I just want to make sure that we're not looking out to 2029 based on a number that could change greatly given the current economic anomalies.
So the major funding sources for this particular model, as you said, are the property taxes and sales taxes. So again, we're looking at historical trends. We are utilizing the city's economist to look at our estimates for future trends on sales tax growth. And we are being conservative in those estimates. So we are allowing for what is happening in the market now.
And Ms. Isel, one other thing I would add is that one of the advantages of the steady state method for how we build the debt model is that if we do have some kind of a recession or some kind of a downturn, we would be okay for what we are ready to issue this year. The impact would essentially be next year when we come in and give you a steady state number, you would note that it went down significantly. So, I mean, because we're ensuring there's affordability down the road anyway, we're able to adjust to those pressures a little bit better than if we were taking all our capacity and trying to spend it each year.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Before we move on from the subject of ratings, I just want to stress the fact AAA is a big deal. If you look at municipalities around the country, some of them have junk ratings. And as a result of that, we are able to borrow at these extremely favorable rates. And it's worth noting, too, what the text there said. This is not just a function of our financial position, which is strong, but also of our management. So I wanted to take this opportunity to congratulate you and thank you, Teresa, and all the staff for putting us in a position where we've been able to maintain that rating. It's really exceptional. Appreciate it.
All right. Mr. Phipps?
Thank you. I didn't know you saw my name. I thought my alias was Wendy Bean today. So I had a question about the model itself. How precise was the model in factoring impending rate increases projected for this year?
Are you referring to our interest rate increases?
Right.
Right. So we look at conservative estimates for what we think those rates will be, and we are looking over the long term. So what we have done when we've made our model updates most recently is we have factored in the rate increases that are being talked about that we think will actually occur in the market.
Okay, so we were successful in plotting that in, and it's, I guess it's going to be, well, it's already occurred by, I guess, a quarter point, but we did factor those into our model this time.
We have, yes.
Okay. And my next question is, with respect to the ratings, when is the city scheduled to meet again with our rating agencies? Is that coming up again soon?
So we, each of our credit entities that we call will meet with the rating agencies as we get ready to issue debt. The most imminent of those is related to the airport, so we'll be working on that here very soon. But from a general capital program, I think the next thing will be housing, which we will start probably in the May timeframe, that we'll actually be meeting with the rating agencies then.
Thank you.
All right, are there any other further questions before we move to the next part of our presentation? All right, hearing none. Mr. Jones, what's next?
Well, we will now have an update with their Transportation Capital Investment Program, and we'll have Liz Babson kick us off.
Good afternoon, Council. I am Liz Babson. I'm your Charlotte Department of Transportation Director. If you'll just give us a moment while we wait to get this presentation loaded. Thank you. That's what I'm pushing. Okay, let me try it. There, that one worked. Thank you. All right, great. We're running. So again, as you've heard, we come before you today to talk about our transportation capital programs. We've provided this presentation at the March Budget and Governance Committee just last week. And so this presentation is in response to council discussion and questions about street lighting and sidewalk projects, as well as our resurfacing efforts. So I'll start with a reminder of our journey to complete streets, which helps shows why we have so much need across our transportation system. And then we'll talk through project prioritization for our capital programs with a focus on Vision Zero and street lighting, as well as our sidewalk and pedestrian safety program. And then we'll review our resurfacing program. So with me today, I also have our Deputy Street Superintendent, Charlie Jones, and he's here to go over that program with you as well. And so we've also provided in your packets a number of maps that represent the potential needs for various transportation investments across the city that are achieved through capital funding, and we'll focus on 3 of those today. So this slide shows the draft 5-year bond plan from the FY22 budget. And again, we'll be sharing more detail about Vision Zero, sidewalk and pedestrian safety, and then I'll turn it over to Charlie Jones to go over our street resurfacing program. But before we go into the programs, I really just want to take a moment and reflect on the evolution of Complete Streets. And this really starts to set the stage and the tone for why we are where we are today. We've made a tremendous amount of progress in building Complete Streets, but we do still have a long way to go. So during the first half of the 20th century, streets were really built to support streetcar and accommodate walking. We had connected streets with sidewalks, and the area that we typically refer to as Route 4, which are those streets that are about 4 miles beyond the center city in any direction, provides that street network that I described that was built during the early part of the 1900s. During the second half of the 20th century, which is also the time that we experienced our most significant growth, we moved to a development pattern that was much more auto-oriented. Often this street network is not very connected, and typically access to major residential and business developments has limited entrances and exits with a lot of cul-de-sacs. That limited access is what creates the need for wider thoroughfares in those areas to handle that limited access. And there's limited sidewalks in most of these streets. During the late 1990s and the early 2000s, we really started to shift our policies to create more complete streets and improve access and connectivity throughout the city. We began to require sidewalks on new subdivision streets at this time and introduced our first capital funding program for sidewalk construction in 2002. More significant policy work was then done to continue to ensure complete and connected streets within the city. In 2006, Council adopted our first comprehensive policy associated with transportation investment and programs, and that was our Transportation Action Plan, which has since been updated in 2011 and 2017. The next iteration of that Transportation Action Plan is our Strategic Mobility Plan, and the Transportation and Planning Committee is hearing updates on that plan at this time. In 2007, Council adopted the Urban Street Design Guidelines, and that was a comprehensive guideline for how we build complete streets. By 2010, Council started adopting ordinances that would codify those elements of complete streets for block requirements and new local street designs, which further helped align what was being built in the private investment and ensure that those same expectations were coming through as the private sector built out our street network as well. Now let's talk a little bit about our CIP programs and how that policy work informs prioritization. We've done a lot of substantial policy work, as I mentioned, in developing transportation and mobility policies that build complete streets and advance goals for building that connected mobility network for all users. These policies are focused on safety, with Vision Zero prioritizing investment on our most dangerous corridors, which is also often some of our most congested corridors. These policies are also focused on building a connected network, especially for pedestrians and cyclists, because that's an area where we underinvested in the latter part of the last century. And we want to make sure that we are supporting access to transit and aligning our investment in ways that improve that access, because a transit system that attracts higher ridership is one of our strongest tools in managing congestion on our streets as our city continues to grow. So it's all of this policy work and council support and the data that we have about our transportation system performance that really lays that foundation for prioritizing projects that we pursue with capital funding. So now let's talk a little bit about Vision Zero. So again, safety is foundational in all of the work we do. Safety is an important factor regardless of the program that we're looking at, because that is a piece of data that is part of the criteria when we prioritize projects. But specific to Vision Zero, this program allows us to focus on things that are important in the community and important to council, like street lighting, neighborhood traffic calming, spot safety improvements, to really be agile and respond quickly to safety issues that arise in the community. We also are constantly scanning across the country to see the latest and greatest technology improvements that we can implement to help make our streets safer. Projects are prioritized using the data from our high injury network and our Vision Zero action plan. And this program funding allows us, again, to quickly respond to safety improvements that don't otherwise have funding from another capital source. You'll see in the draft 5-year plan from FY22 that we show a recommendation to double that funding in '22 to $4 million. And so now let's talk a bit more about street lighting, because I know that that's something that's important to this council and the community. And over the years, we've had several conversations with you about street lighting and its importance to creating safer streets across the city. So with the implementation of our Vision Zero program that council approved, was first done in 2018, and that focused on street lighting. Prior to that, we did not have a dedicated funding source to install street lights. They were only installed through developer projects or bigger street improvements. So this Vision Zero funding is a very important tool in making our streets safer as it relates to lighting. We currently have over 77,000 street lights citywide, and I'm happy to report that we are maintaining an average of less than a 5% outage on those lights. That's a big improvement for where we were just 5 years ago, when you heard from me and you heard from the community that there were concerns about too many outages. And so we created a program with existing staff, and we now have our staff going out annually, riding the streets and doing an inventory of 40 to 50% of that system every year. That's really what's brought that outage down from what used to be about a 20% outage rate to now a 5% outage rate. Also, I'd like to point out that we are working closely with Duke Energy on a couple of other projects as well. We're looking at upgrading streetlights to LED. Currently, 25% of our system is already upgraded to LEDs. Any new projects that are installed with LEDs. And we've worked with Duke to prioritize corridors on their list for upgrades, so that we are getting those upgrades on the corridors where they are most needed. And last but certainly not least, in the street lighting area, we're partnering with Duke on a pilot to install smart street lights, and we've installed 200 smart street lights in the North End Smart District.
Mayor, could I ask for a clarification?
Yes, of course, Mr. Gray.
So, Ms. Babson, could you talk about the terms of our arrangements with Duke? Who pays for what? How does it work? Do we pay for electricity? Do they pay for the lights?
So that comes through a rate that is set by the State Energy Commission, and I might have that name wrong, but it's set at the State Utilities Commission. It's set at the state level, and so we pay them a cost associated with the electricity, the maintenance, associated with those street lights. So they technically own the street lights, but we pay for them, and they maintain them.
So if we wanted more streetlights or streetlights at a new location, is there a capital cost to us, or do we just have to negotiate with them within the rates that we pay?
We pay an upfront capital cost to install streetlights.
So we do
And so
pay
you'll
for the lights as they're installed,
Yes,
but
sir.
then we transfer title to them under the terms of our agreement. And at that point, our payments to them, our contract payments to them, cover the maintenance and things like that.
Yes, sir.
So
the ongoing maintenance
if there is
operations.
an issue about maintenance of the lights, we have the right pursuant to the terms of our deal with Duke to require them to fix them.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
And this slide actually gets at that cost a little bit. So that was the great segue into the next piece of this conversation. So again, street lighting projects can be fairly expensive with the capital costs on the front end, depending on a number of factors. And based on some of the experiences we're seeing lately, street classification, for example, determines the pole type that's required. So on our higher speed, higher volume streets, we are seeing cost estimates at this point for breakaway poles. Those are the steel poles that have to be designed. They are costing about $300,000 per mile. The less expensive alternative is a wood pole, and it costs about $200,000 per mile. Again, some of the factors that are impacting the increasing costs that we're seeing are as a result of utility impacts. So if there aren't street lights on the street, there might be a pole line running power up and down that street along with other utilities. And so in order to install a street light on that pole, often we have to relocate those utilities and sometimes even install new poles to accommodate the additional height required to get all of those utilities on that pole. And then last but certainly not least is real estate. If for any reason we're not able to install the street lights and the project within the current right-of-way, then we have to acquire real estate to implement that project. All right, so what does that look like for us? This map shows thoroughfares without streetlights. We currently have 19 miles committed. 15 miles are prioritized, and again, what that means is with the future bond that goes to voters in 2022, if approved, we can proceed with design and construction with Duke on the next 15 miles. So you'll notice that 15 miles is a little bit higher than you might think we could accomplish with the funding that we are looking for in the 22 bond. I'm happy to share with you that we just got approval on February 16th from the state that we received $1 million in bonus allocation funding to build a street lighting project on W.T. Harris Boulevard from Mount Holly Huntersville Road to 85. That's an 8-mile segment. So that's pretty exciting to have gotten that news just recently. All right, moving into sidewalk and pedestrian safety program. That program focuses on walkability and providing an experience that's safe, useful, and inviting. Projects are prioritized using our Charlotte Walks plan, which was a council-adopted plan as well, with overall priorities focusing on safety, congestion, and connectivity. Funding in this program is used to construct new sidewalk, fill in sort of what we call smaller gap sidewalk needs, and then also provide for safe pedestrian crossings and school zones as well. We do have a goal to build 10 miles of sidewalk every year. This comes not only from this capital program, but any other capital project or state project using public dollars. The sidewalk, again, this sidewalk program was initially funded in 2002, and so we've continued sidewalk construction since that time. I want to clarify our reporting in completed sidewalk miles. When I was with the committee last week, I misspoke and said that that 10 miles included developer constructed and completed sidewalks. It does not. That 10 miles is a goal that we typically achieve almost every year, and it is just from public dollars, a majority of which is city funding, but there is some state and federal funding that comes through that as well. And I also wanted to follow up on Council Ajmira's question that she asked about the total miles built by developers. And so up until this time, that's not a number that we have tracked, but I am happy to report that we have just completed a sidewalk inventory to meet ADA requirements across the city. So we now have a very detailed, robust inventory about sidewalk existing sections as well as any gaps or new sections that are needed. And so with that new inventory, we're currently developing a process that will help us capture the sidewalks that will be built by developers in the future, in addition to those that are built with public funding. So we will have a lot better data going forward in the coming year. And then the last thing I'll point out on this slide is in '22, the recommendation for the FY22, from the FY22 five-year bond plan was to increase the sidewalk funding from $15 million to $50 million, which more than triples that funding. And again, just real quickly to reiterate, similar criteria across all programs and projects for transportation capital investment. We really look at safety, congestion, and connectivity. And I want to spend a minute on the connectivity because that's one you don't hear us talk about a lot. On the connectivity piece, we're really ensuring that we're making those important connections to provide people with the access that they need to go to places like schools, parks, greenways, and of course, access to transit. Tying into existing sidewalks to improve that access or extend that access is definitely important. And then we also look at land uses and consider people in certain areas or certain land uses that they might need to access that might be more transit dependent. All right, so pedestrian crossings is another component that's funded through that sidewalk and pedestrian safety program. And these improvements are typically rapid rectangular flashing beacons and pedestrian hybrid beacons. And they range from, in cost, about $50,000 to $300,000, with the lesser expensive one being shown in the photo on the left. And then the more expensive one is our pedestrian hybrid beacon. Again, like I just described, we consider things like traffic volumes, access to transit, and connecting people to the places that they want to go. This is a fairly new treatment for us, and we really just started this about 5 years ago, and since that time, we've installed 60 of these pedestrian crossings across the city. And so what does that look like across the city? Well, this map shows you that in the queue, we currently have 35 crossings that are funded, 15 crossings identified for the 2022 future bond funding, and then there are 47 other crossings that have been evaluated and approved and are awaiting future funding. All right, moving into sidewalks. As with a lot of the work that we are seeing when we take things to construction, we're seeing some significant cost increases. And so these are some of the factors that are increasing the costs of our sidewalks: real estate, utility impacts, and construction costs associated with labor increases and materials increases. And our current range for cost per mile for sidewalk design and construction is ranging anywhere from $4 to $8 million. That's a big number. It's a wide range. That does include the planning, design, and construction, but again, each project is a little unique and a little different, and we are seeing some pretty significant variable costs associated with the cost to deliver some of these projects. You know, again, back to the point that we started sidewalk construction with capital dollars back in 2002. We've been at this now 20 years. And so I would say some of the earlier projects that we completed were probably some of the easier and less expensive projects. And so what we're running into now is that we are moving into those outer edges of the city that were built in the last 50 years, where sidewalks didn't exist, complete streets don't exist, and so we're coming into areas that are much more suburban, that the street cross sections are fairly unimproved, and so a sidewalk project in those areas is starting to cost in the range of almost a street construction project. And so here's what that looks like on a map. These are our thoroughfares without sidewalk. Again, what's shown in green is we have 11 miles of funded sidewalk. We have 5 miles prioritized, and that will move forward into planning and design with the 2022 bond funding. We have another 7 miles where we have evaluation underway. And so what I'll say about this program is it is a continuing program where we are constantly moving projects through planning, design, and construction. And so it's difficult to say with $50 million, you build a set amount of miles. That $50 million allows us to construct some of what's shown in green because it's currently in planning design. And it will allow us to move new projects into that planning and design phase and complete those. And then based on funding availability, once all of those costs come in, we will likely be able to move some of those 7 miles into planning and design. And it's not clear yet if we'll be able to bring them to construction. So of that, within the system, we have a remaining 245 thoroughfare miles without sidewalks. And what that means is we have a current policy that requires a sidewalk on both sides of the street of a thoroughfare. So that's 245 miles total, which means one street with no sidewalks could have sidewalk missing on both sides and counted in that 245.
Before you go to the next slide, is that your next section?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, before we leave this section, I think Mr. Bakari would like to be recognized. Mr. Bakari?
Thank you. First of all, Liz, good job, and I'll just start by saying we're very lucky to have you lead the department. So I'll just make a comment that I think is very relevant to right now budget season and urgency around this. And Liz, I know you pay attention to this. You're in the weeds of it, and I know you believe it in the same way to an extent, which is I think we need to be right now aggressively pursuing not kind of a treading water and how do we move forward incrementally, but how do we move forward into the next level as it relates to smart devices that are IoT ready for every single thing we're replacing, from stoplights to crosswalks to beacons to neighborhood lights, literally everything. And as we know, it's going to cost a lot. But at the end of the day, we're going to get behind. We're already behind if we don't start aggressively pursuing this. And if we keep replacing and expanding the current level of tech across all these things, we're going to be forever lost. But if we really put together an aggressive plan that says in 3 years, every single device, every single asset under the CDOT banner that's out in the community will be replaced with the smart device that's there, the near-term benefits are going to be amazing in that we'll conserve energy, right? We'll in all of our major corridors and intersections where the volume to capacity ratio is failing, we're going to be able to move vehicles more nimbly. We're going to be able to take a huge chunk out of congestion. But then in the midterm, as we're preparing, with other things like 5G and autonomous vehicles and everything, that's going to enable us to be in a spot that is way ahead of the curve, but it won't happen unless we focus in on it. And there is no time other than each budget season to start. So, it's a large item I'm tossing out there, but I think it's probably the most important thing that we could do to stop incrementally making progress and treading water, just trying to chip away at our problems. If we're going to invest somewhere, let's invest in this spot. And I other than it being a high-level statement, Liz, I hope that you'll get some buy-in across the council as well as from the manager to put together an aggressive plan within this budget cycle that can start a big chunk of a 3-year strategy to get it all done and all in place.
All right. Mr. Driggs.
Thank you, Mayor. I mentioned in our committee report outs the kind of magnitudes that are implied here. And maybe I'll talk about that after we've heard the story on paving. I just want to suggest in general, further to Mr. Bakari's point, we need to be more intentional about how this investment ties into our 2040 plan and the other things we're doing. So we have a mobility plan, and are we expecting to get any help from that for these costs? Or, because there's a 20%, I think, designation in there. So, but I just think it would be good if we were clearer about what kind of progress we expect to make, what kind of money that's going to cost, And again, that we're taking on board new technologies, because the 2040 plan is not going to happen entirely on the basis of private investment. And we're going to have to step up. So I don't think it's a budget committee conversation, frankly. I think there's a policy conversation that needs to take place probably in TAP about how we want to approach this, what goals we want to set, and then we can back into the money side of it. But it's got to be a prioritization process in council committee. That does mean that for this year, we're going to have to make reach some conclusions about some of this extra money that we have. But I would hope that that would just be a temporary thing, and that maybe for next year's budget, we would have in place a framework that would apply going forward. I mean, I remember there was a time when we were talking.
Mayor, so from a policy standpoint, I really wonder if we should be having a conversation about requiring developers to also install street lighting alongside some of the sidewalk improvements that are required of them in the city when they develop. I also question whether we need to be a little bit more future forward in our thinking about our criteria for both sidewalks and lights. It seems rather stagnant to me, the eligibility criteria, rather than acknowledging where growth is occurring and assessing that, calculating data that could also be included in the criteria so that we're getting ahead of potential problems that we can foresee for the future. Having said all that, Liz, you were mentioning whether there is sidewalks on both sides of some of these roads. So the scope of 245 miles, that number for thoroughfares without sidewalks is very high. And I look at the map and it's relatively pervasive, particularly, well, geez, I mean, throughout many areas of our city. So you had mentioned, so that 245 includes some areas that have a sidewalk on one side of the street?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Okay, I wonder what the breakdown would be for the streets that have no sidewalks on either side, because I would think that we would want to, at the very least, prioritize areas with no sidewalks on either side in our calculations moving forward, because I think it's better to have a sidewalk on one side than none on either side. In as much as our investment here in sidewalks is concerned, did I hear you right that we're looking at tripling that investment in this year's budget?
Yes, sir. What was approved in FY22 for your draft 5-year bond plan includes an increase to $50 million in the 22 bond.
Okay. So with that to meet, you had mentioned that we have a 10-mile per year goal. Is that to meet that goal?
No, sir. We currently, on average, install about 10 miles a year with all public funding. So not just this program alone, but if we do a street improvement, then the sidewalk gets built as part of that street improvement, again, using public dollars.
I feel like we have such a tremendous need for infrastructure improvements throughout the entire city. It's exhibited here. And to think that with that current 10-mile per year pace, it would be about 25 years, if not longer, to just address current needs. I like that idea of increasing the funding here. That's all the questions I have. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
All right.
If I may,
Yes, please.
I can provide some follow-up information, Councilmember Newton, so thank you for raising the question. I don't have the numbers with me today about the miles of sidewalks that don't exist on those thoroughfares, but we can easily provide that information in a follow-up. What I will say is our current criteria absolutely takes into consideration whether there is the presence of sidewalk on one side or if there is no sidewalk on either side of the thoroughfare. So that goes into the ranking, and so the 245 miles, for example, is ranked, but we are constantly updating that list based on existing conditions changing. So if a new development comes in and builds a sidewalk and changes the demand, and the need for that sidewalk access, then that is taken into consideration as we're constantly updating that list.
I'd like to ask the manager, it's really a follow-up to Mr. Driggs when he said, you know, we need to put all of our resources together on the table and see what comes up. Where do we have opportunity to begin to do something new or to continue what we have? And so to that end, I think we have not gotten the information on the infrastructure bill that has been approved by Congress yet. And a lot of this, I would hope, would allow for local communities, and Charlotte is the size that gets an allocation if they continue to do direct allocations like they have with the COVID funding. We would have a direct allocation, and if it's significant enough for this kind of conversation, I would like the manager to help us understand what all of those opportunities might be, and then put it together with what opportunities that we have, because there might be a way to add that federal infrastructure money to some of the very basic things that we would prioritize.
Sure, Mayor, members of council. We have a team that we've put together, folks in my office, folks across the entire enterprise. And what we are doing is trying to see what are those opportunities for different infrastructure, what are the different infrastructure opportunities? I think there's about 56. And what we have been doing is meeting since November. The problem has been some of the instructions have not come out, and others just came out at the end of January. So trust us, we are looking under every stone to see how we can address the issues that are before us.
Well,
And we'll also make sure that we have some additional information for the council members that are traveling to DC next week.
just one other thing I wanted to say is that there has been some idea not to do allocations to the cities over 500,000. And I just sent a survey in to show how we had used our existing money. Thank you, Sean, for doing the survey. I sent it in, Sean did it. So to let people know that Charlotte put most of its money in community investment and didn't bring it in, but this is the same, if this same criteria stands, I think that we'll be able to persuade that we're using the money correctly in our communities and large cities. So with that, I'm hopeful that we get some information sooner than later. So, Mr. Driggs?
I just wanted to clarify, do we expect that there will just be some allocation, like grants to cities? Or is this going to be a question of having shovel-ready projects and demonstrating what we can put to work?
Yeah, so I'll make sure before I left, I mentioned to Charlotte Lamb, who is working in the manager's office and coordinating all of this, that her name would come out today. So Charlotte, your name did come up. So yes, what we're trying to do, again, a lot of the instructions or some of the I guess the processes that are associated with getting these funds are not with us yet. I'm not sure, Mayor, about this direct allocation, much like, the CARES. It was very good for us, the CARES allocation, because we were one of, I think, 38 cities in the country.
Being challenged now.
Yeah.
I do think that there will be different levels, Mr. Driggs. Some will require match, and do you have the money ready to go? And that's likely to be I would assume, if I were sitting in that office doing that, I'd say, well, we want to make a big impact, and where can we make a big impact? I mean, it's just the political part of what this can be. And so I would expect some of them will require match, and then perhaps because of other sizes and amounts, we will.
And that could entail
have that.
other conversations.
That could be other conversations.
I'm just happy to hear that someone named Charlotte is working on this.
All right. Mr. Graham?
It's just a quick question, though. And so do you anticipate that this may line up with our budget cycle in terms of going down, in terms of hearing from DC, a little bit more specifics as relates to how we kind of make sure that we can talk about both at the same time?
So I'll answer that a couple of different ways. Like the manager mentioned, there's been a city manager's office-led group that's been working on this for a while. So the programs that already existed and just got new funding, we have more rules on them. For instance, the airport can identify funds that they already know they're going to get over the next 5 years from the bill, and they'll talk about that next month at the budget workshop. But some of the other information and new programs, The rules aren't there yet, but there's two good signs that line up with our budget process. Number one is so much of our capital funding is program related with prioritization, like take sidewalk and pedestrian safety. If there are programs that line up that could draw in federal funds, they would essentially move up the prioritization list so we can try to maximize as many funds as we're able to get. So that includes sidewalks, Vision Zero, congestion mitigation, corridors, our bridge program, bike facilities. As we go through this, because we would have to go to the voters first, and then we wouldn't have access to the funds until January. So by then, we would know more from the federal agencies on how we can try to maximize our federal investment. The other thing I'd mention is there is within the bill discussion of what they call disadvantaged census tracts, where local matches would potentially be waived. So we'll want to be really aggressive on that front as well to try to draw in as much federal funds as we can.
So we can do forward planning with anticipation.
Yep.
Yes. All right, so Ms. Johnson? Ms. Johnson?
Mayor, yes. Thank you. I have a question and then a comment. My question is for Liz. Liz, I'm looking at this, the thoroughfares without sidewalks and also the street light. And I see a overwhelming amount in District 4, which I know has a lot of state-funded or state-owned roads. Does that present an additional challenge for the improvement in this area?
So I'll answer that a couple of ways. On the street lighting front, many of the roads that are state-owned, state-maintained are those higher volume, higher speed facilities. And they often require, again, what we call breakaway poles, which are fairly expensive. And so that cost is going to be slightly higher to install street lighting, for example, on a lot of those facilities. And yes, you're correct. Many of those are in District 4. Again, you know, the other thing to point out is that NCDOT does not install street lights on any of their streets except the interstate system. And so any street lighting remaining on any streets within the city is then the responsibility of the city if we want to pursue that. Same thing with sidewalks. They do not install sidewalks on their facilities. They do have a complete streets policy, and so now they do allow for sidewalks to be completed within their right-of-way, but we typically carry the cost of that and then the long-term maintenance of that as well.
So from a practical perspective, if we're talking about streets like W.T. Harris and Mallard Creek and Sugar Creek and University City Boulevards, all of these streets that need these safety improvements, so you're saying that these items cost more, we need to budget more for this area to make these improvements?
So not necessarily. It does depend on each project. And as I mentioned, you know, I use sidewalks as an example. Those costs range anywhere from about $4 to $8 million a mile is what we're seeing to plan, design, and construct a sidewalk segment. So it's not as much a function of whether or not it's a state-maintained road or a city-maintained road. It's just the complexity of each project. And some are more expensive to construct than others.
Okay, thank you. And then my comment is for Mr. Jones, and I think the council. When I look at this map with the thoroughfares without sidewalks, this looks like districts 2, 3, and 4. So if we look at this from an equitable perspective, this is kind of the reason why there's a tale of two cities in this city. And I don't know if it's because of the development, the age of the development in this area, but I mean, we as a council, if we talk about bridging the wealth gap and looking at things from a racial equity perspective, I think this is a demonstration of an area where we can make really big impact. And I think we just need to be very intentional about improving the infrastructure of the city. When you have sidewalks, people are able to walk to the bus stops, and there's safety issues. And this illustration is just really, it's just demonstrative of how areas are being left behind in the city. So I just think that we should really take a look at this, and this is truly an area where we can increase the budget and the dollars and focus on the infrastructure. I know that there's not a decision on the federal infrastructure dollars, but this is an opportunity for us as a council, again, to put our money where our mouths are. We can look at this from an equitable perspective and just really focus on this. I'd like to see more dollars targeted towards current infrastructure instead of future development. We have to take care of the residents that we have. And again, the sidewalks is just an area. If you look at this map, this is an area where we can truly improve lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. I had a program last night with WFAE, and Eli Portillo at the university verifies your comments with facts where the development went and the roads went, and in terms of how the city was designed in the years that not any of us were sitting around, but your assessment is backed up by research as well. And the question I think that we have is how to have that discussion in a way that keeps everyone engaged and understanding it, and making sure that people understand the reason why as well as what. Thank you so much for that. Mr. Winston?
Yes, thank you. I guess this comment, is to Madam Mayor, Mr. Manager, and all colleagues on council. I feel like we need to be careful when we talk about the idea of extra debt capacity. Because, as I'm hearing this, as I'm considering this, I can't help but think that we have a $12 billion hole in our needs and our plans when it comes to growth and investing in transportation. I know our greater transportation needs are bigger than the TMN, the Transformative Mobility Network. They're bigger than that one idea. But all the pieces in this presentation are integral parts of that plan. The TMN, which I think is a comprehensive transportation plan that does have significant transit investments, but it feels like this, where we're at right here, meaning our City of Charlotte budgeting process and our capital planning initiatives, this is where we can and need to provide better answers to our neighbors and our partners in the region on how we intend to put our skin in the game before we ask them to. So when I see you present those bars, Mr. Manager, which is great, with this extra capacity, and also pointing out, that there is no property tax increase to make that happen. If I'm my partners here, that are asking, well, I'm like, well, what are they going to do, to help answer some of those questions? And why should I consider increasing my taxes to help pay for this plan that they're going to significantly benefit from? I would ask, am I off base? Or will we get to a part in this? Because it hasn't been touched, and I see we're going into street resurfacing. We haven't talked about it in that capacity, and I would imagine if we don't do that during this budget process, it's going to be a real opportunity lost to consider how we make some of those investments, internally. Yes.
So thank you, Councilman Winston, and I'll try to do this in a concise fashion. I don't disagree with you at all. If we struggled with this slide, just wait until we get to street resurfacing, okay? And so Liz and I have had a number of conversations about how to position this the right way, and I agree with everything that's been said. But one thing that I would put out there is that even if we had all of the funding, even if there was a mathematical calculation that could do whatever the number is to do this, I'm not sure each one of these would end up being a project. So if there's any takeaway, I would hope that we understand that we're not suggesting that if we had whatever the mathematical calculation is, that we would do all 245 miles, because some of them may not be viable projects. So let's jump to what you said next. So if everybody would bear with me for a little bit, so Mr. Winston nailed it. He talked about transportation, and we're talking about transportation, but there's also transit. And with transit, there is a plan. It's CAT's 2030 plan, which has been approved by the MTC. And then when you add on top of that, when the CEO, CAT CEO, talks about Envision My Ride, that is transit, all of these various lines, whether it's light rail, commuter rail, or streetcar, plus getting our bus system up to a point where we have the different types of frequencies that this community wants. And there's no funding for that, okay? And so when you start to put it all together, if I'm understanding you, which I think I am, is that whatever the revenue sources are, there are needs both on the transit side that aren't funded, and there are needs on the transportation side that aren't funded. And I hope staff is doing its due diligence to at least put it out in front of you, so that you don't make one decision today and then you say, well, had you told me that, we may not have made that decision. So that's the beginning of the discussion. And to your point, as Mr. Bergman said earlier, the third budget workshop will include our enterprise funds, including CATS. That's not a specific part of today's, but at your next workshop, we will have our enterprise funds, which includes CATS and the transit piece.
Well, I hear that, but again, just going back to the presentation that we have today, and this has been part of our difficulty in explaining the TMN to the community at large, right? It's not just the Silver Line, it's not just those transit aspects that you talked about, right? It is implementing along that route, those Vision Zero goals, right? Dealing with street lighting, dealing with improving pedestrian crossings along those alignments. You know, all of those sidewalks and bike ped infrastructure that will go there, right? Those are the things that we haven't been too effectively able to communicate and talk about, honestly, even amongst ourselves. But this is what council members continue to ask. How are we going to pay for those things, right? So I really do think, as we're thinking about this, and as we're thinking about those future, 4 or 5 year bond cycles, aren't some of those answers about how we're going to do that have to come out of here? And don't we have an opportunity to bring more clarity to the conversation?
Absolutely. And so I tried to just stick with plans first, and now you've moved over to the revenue source. So when we talk about TMN, it's only a financing tool. So with that, you're right again, a part of that financing tool would pay for the transit piece, and a part would pay for the transportation piece, roads, sidewalks, bike paths, greenways, all the things that are in our CIP as well as the county CIP. So the funding source, whether it's, forgive me, Mr. Driggs, something dealing with property tax or sales tax or a revenue source, would be needed to advance many of these projects.
So would that be part of the CIP discussion moving forward or not?
So a part of the CIP discussion, even with this additional capacity, you could choose to not utilize any of it. To, I guess, Mr. Bakari's point, and I'm not saying this is your point, Mr. Bakari, but do you come up with a plan that has more to do with smart devices, smart technologies, right? But there will come a day that if this community is talking about Connect Beyond, which is bigger than the TMN, bigger than the 2030 plan, which I hope is what we're trying to do, multiple counties trying to have the connectivity, then there will have to be a broader discussion amongst this entire region about how do you pay for it. And as there are federal dollars, as we talked about earlier, that are now in the queue, without having something that's shovel-ready or a revenue source to match these funds, it becomes more difficult to pull in the federal funds.
All right, thank you, Mr. Winston. Mayor Pro Tem?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I think this is a really good discussion, and I thought it was interesting when we were in Austin. One of the things that we learned is that when with the issue of transit versus transportation is that Austin split the referendum into two pieces, one for transit and one for greenways, sidewalks, whatnot. And that portion passed at a higher level, like 70%. Transit passed at 60%, but it really showed that how much people value greenways and sidewalks. And so I think, I like that we're spending this much time talking about sidewalks. And that leads to my other question is, Liz, what portion of the funding is available to fix existing sidewalks? Charlotte is a city of beautiful trees, but those trees tend to have roots that can push up sidewalks to the, and we've got many sidewalks that you go from one chunk to another and it's a good 3 or 4 inch difference and it's kind of treacherous. I'm either incredibly clumsy, which probably is true, but I've been a victim of our sidewalks a couple of times when they're covered in leaves, whatnot. But I just wonder how that ranks, what pot of money is put aside to invest in fixing existing sidewalks?
So repair and maintenance of our existing sidewalks is done through our operating budget or general fund. So we handle that. That is not a capital expense for us.
Okay. Would it be
I will share with you, and Charlie can speak to this way better than I can if you want more details, but we have started a new approach just in the last several years, to your point. Not all sidewalk repairs where we see sidewalk heaving has to be totally reconstructed. And what we have found is that there is a technique called grinding, and so we're starting to do that on an annual basis throughout the city to remove those trip hazards where we can do that without construction.
Great. Okay. Do you know offhand though, Liz, like what kind of a backlog we have on fixing, repairs to existing sidewalks? The dollar value that we have available probably isn't really relevant. It's more a matter of if a citizen calls in and says, we have a really bad sidewalk situation here, wheelchairs, bikes, strollers, having a hard time, what kind of a backlog would that be?
I think I need to follow up with you on that. Need a little bit of time to look at our data. I will share with you and just make an important connection. Again, we're seeing in the labor and trades workforce, which is the group that performs these types of maintenance and repair activities, we're seeing higher than normal vacancy rates. And so I do have concerns that might be impacting our ability to respond as quickly as we might have in the past. But we'll follow up and provide you with that information.
Okay, thank you.
So we have a pre-COVID and a post-COVID description. That's great. Mr. Driggs.
Thank you, Mayor.
And followed by Ms. Ajmira.
I think what's coming out here is we are trying to plan in the context of great uncertainty, right? We don't know what kind of sales tax revenue we're going to have. One of my concerns has been that we keep talking 66 miles of road in our transportation mobility plan network, and that split is strongly biased towards rail in a way that is going to cost us in other areas. But that's another conversation for another day. But I think the thing that we need to wake up to right now is the fact that we don't have answers to questions about how we intend to proceed to meet these needs. And again, 245 miles, clearly not all of those miles are essential. Some of those miles will get paid for privately. But when you consider that the aggregate cost of that is somewhere between $1 billion and $2 billion, I think it's safe to say that the amount that the city is going to end up wanting to pay is big. And in relation to the 23 miles that we have at different stages right now. So I think the planning process needs to start. I'm not sure it can get done in the time frame of the budget cycle that we're in. So we're going to have to come up with some answers for this year. But I just hope we'll start preparing for a better conversation about resource allocation and the realization of some of these needs. Thank you.
All right, Ms. Ajmira.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So a couple of questions. Amen to everything my colleagues have said and discussed. Certainly been a great suggestion, a great discussion. A couple of questions to Ms. Babson. What is the gap that we have to fill because of the budget cuts from the state? And that was not specific to sidewalk.
No, ma'am, it was associated with the Powell bill, and that's the next portion of the presentation we're going to go over when we give you an update on resurfacing.
So we really tried to give the break so that we didn't forget everything. So Ms. Ajmer, we'll come back to
Yeah,
that at
so
the beginning of.
I will limit my questions to just sidewalks.
Yes, that'd be great.
It's
Thanks.
great that we have a huge increase from 15 to $50 million towards our sidewalks. But just from hearing all my colleagues, certainly this is a priority for many of my colleagues, where we do need to invest more. So I hope to see some of the $37 million additional capacity going towards sidewalks, specifically where we have a major gap, where it's clearly outlined here on this map. But I will save some of my other questions for the next slide. I've already gone through this presentation in our budget committee, so I'm a few steps ahead, but I'll save my questions for later.
And I will make you the first on the list for the next section. If everyone is done, we'll go. Mr. Graham, are you on sidewalk still? I'm sorry, who's?
Still have my hand up.
I had, Mr. Phipps.
Thank you, Mayor. I was wondering, in those areas that are in the ETJ that get merged into the city, I live in the Back Creek section, and we were merged into city limits in 2003. So we've been in the city now for 19 years, and there's still a lot of projects that we could have benefit of. So I'm wondering, in those areas that's in the ETG that come into the city, the more suburban areas trying to get urbanized, I know that there are priorities that already pre-existed before entry into these ETG areas into the city. So, I mean, do those areas, how do we prioritize needs for newly arrived sections of the county coming into the city? Do the priorities that were in the urban areas, do they still get prioritization since they were there first, or are we more or less targeting even areas in newly acquired acreage? Are we assigning them a priority also?
So Councilmember Phipps, the way I'll answer that question is, again, that's the benefit of this sort of ongoing program with continued funding and the fact that we're constantly updating our prioritization, our list of potential projects based on any new information. And so again, going back to some of the earlier slides, and you've heard me talk about this a lot, it's safety, congestion, and connectivity. And so we're looking at land uses, we're looking at whether or not there have been pedestrian crashes. We're looking at all of the data that we have available across the entire city, and we don't separate out whether or not an area was recently annexed and treat that any differently. We're trying to find the best place to put those limited resources where we have the greatest need based on the data.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think we'll go to street resurfacing.
I still have my hand
Mr.
up.
Bakari, I'm sorry, I did not see you. Mr. Bakari?
Thanks. So since the retreat, I've been working with several people on broader funding initiatives that touch all of these things, touch the Transformational Mobility Network, where that last left off, and I've made some substantial progress, again, as an individual, not representing council. I am happy to give any of my colleagues updates on this, should it interest you, but I think the punchline of what I'm finding and how it relates to this is what I heard from your Austin trip, which to me seems pretty interesting concept to follow, is that they, I believe, followed more of a 50-50 transit and transportation split across all of their efforts. And when you think about that and the fact is that we're learning from the towns as we have these conversations, the General Assembly, the private sector, major players, on one side, got kind of some desires for other things and other capabilities. On the other, we're seeing some real potential to unlock funds from the state level, capitalize on things like that. But we have to have something that the feds recognize. So I'm seeing a pathway right now on some levels of transit, not everything that was in the TMN, but also a mixture of not what's currently stated in the 80-20 mix of other transportations, particularly roads and sidewalks and things of that nature, but the opportunity to expand that more towards a true 50-50 forward look, some of the things we've just been discussing. So if there's a point where this can merge and make sense to merge back into a more formal council effort, I think the thing staff can be doing right now to prepare for that so we can move fast as we're going to need to is what does not a 80-20 perspective of transportation look like, but a 50-50? And where would our moonshots be in investing in all of those smart transportation CDOT devices? What does that big bang look like? What are all of those things, both all the way from the Charlotte area, all the way up into the towns, into the surrounding areas? Because if we get an at-bat at this, and all of a sudden some things unlock that weren't possible before, we're going to find ourselves in a situation where we're scrambling, and either we have to create a plan that is didn't have the time to really get the merit and attention it deserved, or we're going to have to pass on the opportunity because we're just not going to be ready to do that. So again, if anyone's interested to hear some of the updates, I'm glad to do that offline with you. But I think that's my punchline for staff and the manager, which is it's not done yet, but it has progressed to a point it has not in the past. And I would really think that if we're going to go after this hard and some doors unlock, we should be ready to react nimbly when that happens.
Okay, thank you. All right, now we'll go to street resurfacing.
You got this, Charlie.
There we go. After the mayor's buildup, I hate to disappoint. Good afternoon, Charlie Jones, Deputy Street Superintendent for the Street Maintenance Division of CDOT. When we talk about resurfacing for the city of Charlotte, there are two main goals for this program. The first is to extend the life of the pavement assets of the city, and the second is to reduce the costs associated with maintaining this large asset. Just how big is the city of Charlotte street system? We currently maintain 5,479 lane miles of streets. Put that in perspective for everyone, you could drive from Charlotte to San Francisco and back in 5,424 miles. So it's a quite extensive street network we maintain. There's one primary measure used to quantify the overall health of our road network, and this measure is the pavement condition rating, otherwise known as the PCR. The PCR measurement represents the condition of the entire street network at a specific point in time. The ranges represented in the chart to the right are an industry standard breakdown of PCR ranges from very good to very poor and include the percentage of Charlotte streets rated in each category. Streets are rated on a scale of 0 to 100, with 100 being a newly resurfaced street and a 0 rated street being one with significant distresses and failures. Trained pavement raters or artificial intelligence-based systems evaluate the pavement surface and deduct points for distresses such as potholes, rutting, utility cuts, cracks, heaved areas, and just general rough pavements. Based on our last survey conducted in 2019, 62% of Charlotte streets were rated good or very good. One of the key factors that affects the pavement condition rating is the age of the pavement surface. And I'll take a quick break there to talk about how a road's constructed. Roads are built in layers. The top surface not only gives you a smooth surface to drive on, but it also protects the layers that are beneath that provide that structural strength for the road. The resurfacing process replaces this top layer as it ages to restore the smooth ride, but just as important, it protects the structural elements of the road beneath. As the surface layer cracks and becomes brittle with age, moisture and physical strains will penetrate to the lower road layers and require more repairs than just resurfacing. Typical surface layer of asphalt has a useful life of 18 to 20 years. Show a few pictures of Charlotte roads here. These are actual city streets, and we can show the progression of pavement conditions over time. Starting on the left, you can see a freshly paved street. This street will remain in this condition for several years. Most streets in the Charlotte network fall into the good category, as seen in the second image. You may notice some cracking, but all in all, the surface is relatively smooth, and the cracks are not covering significant areas of the road. That road surface is approximately 5 to 10 years old. The third image is a road surface between 10 to 15 years old. You can see a considerable amount of cracking and a significant patch in the middle of the road, and there's a good chance that portions of that street will need additional repairs when it comes time for resurfacing. The final image is a street that has not been paved in more than 25 years. Potholes are evident, and the amount of cracking and loose stone indicates that the base of the road has been compromised. These 4 photos kind of show the standard deterioration process, and it assumes that only normal traffic and the environment are affecting the road surface. In reality, utility cuts, overweight vehicles, leaking pipes, and other factors can accelerate that standard deterioration process. This chart from the Federal Highway Administration illustrates the timing of maintenance activities and the steep deterioration in the pavement quality once a poor condition is experienced or pavements are beginning to reach the end of their useful life. Road surface quality typically drops around 40% after 15 to 18 years. While the overall ride quality and appearance of the road is what most of us associate with a need for resurfacing, this decline in quality also comes with a higher price tag when it's time to resurface. The longer the cracks and distresses are allowed to persist on the road surface, the higher the likelihood that the subsurface layers are damaged and will also need to be repaired. Costs for preservation, which includes resurfacing, are 6 to 10 times less than reconstruction later in a pavement's useful life. So to avoid increases in maintenance costs, the best practice is to treat or replace the surface layer in as timely a manner as possible. CDOT's worked over the years to evaluate and select additional treatment options to extend pavement life. We are currently applying materials within the first 2 to 4 years following resurfacing that have successfully reduced cracking. And we have other treatment options that are applied later in the pavement's life, but they tend not to be well received by our residents. Okay. Sorry about that, I was out of order. What are some of the challenges CDOT faces to maintain the resurfacing program? One, our network continues to grow. Average annual growth in the Charlotte street network is 30-plus lane miles each year. This includes new street construction by the City of Charlotte and developers, as well as the acceptance of private streets located within the city limits. Construction costs continue to rise. While we haven't experienced the drastic increases seen in some construction activities, we've experienced an increase in the cost to resurface streets. Since 2016, the average annual increase is about 12%. Oil prices, labor rates, and general inflation all play a factor in these increases. Increases in costs can significantly reduce the number of miles we're able to pave annually. And finally, funding for resurfacing has not kept pace with the growth of the system and cost increases. Since 2016, funding from the state of North Carolina has not increased despite increased system mileage and increases in resurfacing costs. So where do we currently stand? Based on our last pavement evaluation conducted in 2019, Charlotte's current pavement condition rating is 82 out of 100, which is at the lower end of the good category, but still in the good category. Charlotte's resurfacing cycle is currently 35 years. In layman's terms, if a street's resurfaced this year in 2022, it will not be resurfaced again until 2057. CDOT has been strategic with the allocation of contract funding during the pandemic, which has allowed us to minimize the impact to the resurfacing cycle and pavement condition rating. However, years of reductions in state funding will cause the resurfacing cycle to increase significantly in 2023. Funding for street maintenance activities, as these charts show on the right, prior to FY20 was approximately $25 million annually. This included funding allocated from the general fund by council in the early 2000s and more recently, strategic recommendations by the manager's office, approved by City Council, and voted on by residents during the bond referendum, shifted a portion of resurfacing funding from the general fund to general obligation and pay-go bonds, and resulted in an increase of $1 million annually. Unfortunately, pandemic shortfalls reduced Powell bill distributions from the state in 2021, and the state budget passed in late '21 kept the $6.8 million reductions for Charlotte effective for the FY22 and FY23 budget years. So I'll wrap up the discussion today with a breakdown of a few funding scenarios and the projected impacts they would have on the resurfacing cycle. Starting on the left, we estimate that restoration of the current Powell bill funding gap, approximately $6.8 million, would result in a resurfacing cycle remaining constant around that 35-year range. Restoration of the Powell bill funding gap with an additional $3 million would shift the resurfacing cycle lower to a 30-year cycle. And then finally, an additional $6 million would result in a 25-year cycle. We've determined through our projections that an additional $3 million in funding reduces the resurfacing cycle by approximately 5 years on average. With that, if there's any questions, we're happy to take them.
We'll start with Ms. Ashmira, followed by Mr. Griggs, and then Ms. Johnson. Ms. Ashmira?
Yes, thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you for this presentation. So I appreciate that you have given us 3 scenarios. But what is the recommendation? What should really be the cycle? What should resurfacing cycle be? What is the recommendation that staff has? Is it 25-year, 20-year, 30-year?
So let me try to take that. The resurfacing program would have been a topic we likely needed to talk about at a budget cycle, even without the Powell bill reduction. So, I mean, when Charlie's talking about the number of years, it's really, we're looking at a point in time right now. And there's kind of a convergence right now where we have the Powell bill distribution. We also have a national labor shortage, energy prices, material prices. It's a really difficult time to run this program. So I think that CDOT would always say the best thing to do is to get as much money into it as possible to get the resurfacing level low. We know that City Council is also looking at a lot of other priorities. I think one thing we're trying to signal here is that the restoration of Powell bill is almost a starting point rather than a decision, because the cycle with everything going on without restoration, it just becomes really high. So I think we want to talk about getting that cycle lower through a number of different ways. I'll talk about it a little bit in the next presentation when we talk about some of that capacity, but then also throughout the remainder of the budget season, we'll continue to explore other options through operating and pay-go and some of how we do things to try to get that as low as possible. But I wouldn't look at it as whatever we do in FY23 is our solution forever, because this can be a multi-year process.
Got it. Okay. Well, I'll wait for the next presentations that you have lined up here, that you have lined up. But this is very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Ryan, I want to make sure that you're saying that your recommendation may come with the manager's recommendation on the budget. Is that?
Well, let me give it a shot.
I'm asking.
No, so.
We can't hear you, Madam Mayor.
What did you say? I was asking Ryan for when would we have a recommendation?
And so I'll take that, Mayor and Council. So if you ask Liz, I'm convinced Liz would say, get me on a 20-year cycle. I'm convinced Liz would say, build every sidewalk, give me every light. She's the subject matter expert. If you ask Ryan, part of Ryan's job is to make sure that we give you a structurally balanced budget. So, Ms. Ashmira, we have to balance this, and we need information from you, right? If you say to us.
Yeah, that's. Oh, I'm sorry.
If you say to us, you would like for us to prioritize, let's say sidewalks over resurfacing, that's a decision. We'll always give you our best recommendation, and right now, our best recommendation will be based on getting some feedback from you, and that's why we have the workshop.
Okay, good question.
Yeah, so currently we don't have the information on what's the balance. Obviously, Ms. Babson is going to tell us from the maintenance and transportation perspective, right? And Ryan is going to speak from the budget perspective. We don't know what the balance is, and that's what we are looking for. Should we be looking at the scenario where it's Powell bill plus 6 million to ensure that we are not incurring or we are not taking away from anything in future if it's going to add additional cost in the future because we are just keep deferring the problem to next year and the year after and so on. We don't want to do that either. So I guess I'm looking for recommendation as what would be the scenario where we are not adding additional costs down the line.
So absolutely, our recommendation is we need to get the Powell bill restored. That's step one, okay? Because if that doesn't occur, you will just see a deterioration of our roads unless we make a significant capital investment to backfill the loss of the Powell bill.
Got it. Okay, so that's the starting point. So this Powell bill was, would that be out? I guess when would state legislators be discussing it again?
I'm going to recognize.
Because this is just this short-term impact from what I understand, or is this going to be permanent? I'm not clear on that.
So it originated as 1 year during the pandemic, but the most recently approved budget, which was a normal budget, has the reduction in there. So at this point, that is what we're going off of. And from a budget standpoint, we're trying to plan in the near term for not having those funds. Long term, it'd be great if we can get them restored.
Ryan, can you tell us the source of Powell bill money and how the formula works and how the allocations should, what was the practice and what do we have now?
So Liz can give a little bit better than me, but basically there was a formula at the state level, and then this past year, the formula put a cap on cities with more than, I forget if it was 400 or 500,000 residents, which was only us and Raleigh. So it essentially froze us at the previous year's level, and the previous year was, I believe, 2/3 of the previous year's level. So it basically is just a cap on cities over a certain size. Yes.
Got it. It's just a different methodology that's being used at the state level, but that's just the short term. We don't know what's going to happen in the long run. And
Ms. Ajmera, I don't know if you heard, but this is money from gas tax. And if you think about the direction that the country and the state, and I believe I heard the Secretary of Transportation say that they're going to do tax credits for EVs. So gas tax, I think Ryan was telling us, we had a problem. It's maybe even worse now, but it is not going to get better as we move towards different technology for vehicles. So I think that it's, just to be sure, the gas tax is probably down even now. I don't know, Liz, if you have any numbers about it. So gas tax going down, a cut, the formula, we're probably looking at how are we paving our roads with city money. And that's just kind of the thing.
so even with the gas tax going down, it would have an overall impact statewide, but this is really the largest cities like Raleigh and Charlotte is having to bear the biggest burden here. So
That's correct. I mean, and let me be a little bit more specific on what we're trying to display here. I mean, we're looking at this from this budget cycle perspective. And so when you see Restore Powell bill, we're talking about the options for using city dollars in this budget cycle to restore Powell bill. We're not getting into the political aspect of intergovernmental relations or anything.
Got it. Okay, well, I know we have a short-term problem to solve, like, while intergovernmental committee works on the longer-term solution here. So, yeah, I completely agree, we do, and I support it. We definitely need to fill that $6.8 million short-term gap that we have in front of us right now. So yes, I do support that, but what I'd like to hear from our transportation team, Liz Babson and her peers, as to not incur additional liability down the line. Should we be looking at the scenario that's presented in the middle, plus 3 million? Or should we be looking at 6 million, or are we okay with just the beginning of 6.8?
Liz, I'll help you, okay? So Ms. Ashmera, Councilmember Ashmera, Ryan, I hate to put you on the spot, but I know you're ready for this. The last time that we did a budget workshop, we had a gap of about how much? I'm sorry, you didn't call it a gap, a challenge.
The challenge of about 7.6 million.
Okay, so Councilmember Ashmera, as we try to address the budget challenge that we have for FY23, at the first workshop, and typically I would give you an update at each workshop, so I apologize I didn't do it now. We still had a challenge, and I'm not sure how much of this was even factored into that, Ryan. And so as we do our Q&As and give you follow-ups, again, if we were to get to a 25-year cycle, I can tell you with certainty it would be difficult for this council to do some things, or at least for me to produce a budget for you to receive that would include some of the things I think have ranked higher, like compensation for our salaried employees, where we have vacancy rates north of 12, 13%. So again, it's taking into consideration all of the competing priorities. This is important, but again, if we went to 25 years, even 20 years, I can tell you there are going to be some other things that you've suggested that we do that we will not be able to do.
Got it. Okay, that helps. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Driggs.
Thank you, Mayor. Mr. Jones, we don't see you here often. I just want to tell you this is a very informative and actionable presentation. Really appreciate it. Thank you. I think this points to what I've been saying about we need to be programmatic about these things, right? And I think that in this excellent presentation, the picture, the graph, makes pretty clear that a stitch in time saves 9, right? You're talking about $1 million for timely ongoing preservation, and you're talking about 6 to 10 million if you allow the roads to deteriorate past a certain point, because as was explained to us, you start to get a deterioration of the infrastructure of the road, which requires much more expensive. So it's incredibly short-sighted to put yourself in a position where you're having to spend the $6 to $10 million instead of saying on top of this. But you're right, it's going to involve some tough questions, and I've brought this up before. It's controversial, but I think that in relation to our very basic responsibilities for infrastructure and so on, the investment that we are making in affordable housing is extravagant. It's a critical priority. I don't dispute it, and I'm 100% on board. But you have to recognize that as we confront these challenges at the level of our most basic responsibilities, we need to keep in mind 25% of our capital budget right now is allocated to one of our priorities. And I'll just say that. I hope it's not interpreted as being political. The other thing I would mention is that the Powell bill money falls under operating, right? So we're not going to solve the Powell bill issue and the resurfacing issue with capital dollars, with our $37 million.
It's actually a combination of both. The majority is operating, but there is $4 million per year or $8 million per bond currently in our transportation bonds.
Right, but it does just highlight the point, as the manager was suggesting, that this actually is probably more part of our operating budget conversation than it is our CIP conversation.
Mr. Driggs, I want to say that when you're talking about the looking at one part of our capital budget that we put into housing and affordability, I actually think the question might be best framed as, what do we do to help the communities that have been probably placed in jeopardy because of past practices of equity and what's most important to them. And I guess that's one of the reasons that I would like, really to have this idea of this equity conversation come up, because we do need all of this. And it's going to be tough, but I would say instead of framing it as capital to capital, it's really just like anything else. Where do we get the most value and where do we see the most progress while taking care of the values that we have? So it's just, I want you to know that I appreciate what you've said, and that my lens of looking through it is how do we do the very best for our neighborhoods and the people that we're trying to get in our corridors, and what's the impact there?
And Mayor, I'm not criticizing that. I'm just saying, again, if you look across the entire spectrum of commitments we have, our 2040 plan, the very basic obligations we have on infrastructure, we need to be sure that we've got the right balance.
And I agree with you, and I think that balance includes infrastructure in those communities that we are seeing the disinvestment of for a long time. That's what, how do we qualify and quantify that? The next speaker that we have is Ms. Johnson. Ms. Johnson?
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Madam Mayor. I wanted to ask what the policy is for street pavement on state-maintained roads. And then also, if we could go back to slide number 20, I have a question about that also. Thanks.
Not sure which one 20 is. There you go. I can speak very quickly to state-maintained roadways. We do not maintain state-maintained roadways, and that extends all the way to, patching potholes. Whenever we observe issues on state-maintained roadways or residents call us at Street Maintenance Division, we refer those over to NCDOT for them to work to address. So that's the breakdown of maintenance on state versus city.
Okay, thank you. And then I wanted to know if we have a map of this table. I'd love to see, just like we saw the street lights and the sidewalk, I'd like to see these ratings mapped out, like among the district, like where are, and even color coded, where are the very good roads and the good roads and fair. I'd like to see that in a map format.
That's something we can produce. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. And so let me just add for Mr. Jones, I don't know if residents recognize where they live and where state-maintained roads are. It really presents a challenge for me in District 4 with the litter and the lawn and the cutting the grass and potholes and street lights, just these kind of issues. I'd love, Mr. Jones, if there was a page on the website where residents could identify these state-owned roads, so that they see, that perhaps they can reach out to the senator's office or something. But I think residents should know that streets like W.T. Harris and Mallard Creek and others are state-maintained roads. So if we could provide that information for residents, I think that will be very helpful in them getting the needs addressed when they have concerns.
Great idea, Councilmember Johnson. I'm looking at Liz we'll
Yes,
get
we
that
should be
done.
able to work with Charlotte Communications to put something available on the website that'll help clarify that. I will share with you, though, we work very closely with 311, so they have a script by which they use to communicate with residents when they call in and ask for those types of services on state-maintained roads.
Thank you, and I just think it provides information, so when they have a concern about a pothole on, W.T. Harris, we're not passing the buck, but it's our, what we're able to do. So if they have the resource on who to contact when they have a problem on those roads, it will be very helpful in them getting things done for their areas.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Mr. Winston?
Thanks.
Mr. Winston?
Thank you. I have, I guess, a couple of, I'll ask all my questions, and you guys can decide whether to answer them now or follow up. So sometimes I think from an athlete's perspective, and I know when you're trying to strengthen one part of the body, you know, sometimes you have to attack other parts first. So I saw on that street deterioration over 25 years, I don't know if any of these would be defined as a complete street as we look at them right now. So I'm wondering, does a complete street perhaps increase the durability of pavements over time if you have, you know, if it's not just going to a piece of road just ending on a piece of grass, you know? If you have more structure, does that help? Are streets recycled? So what happens to all the old street when it's torn up? Are there any circular economy opportunities here? I would also say any of our resurfacing plans, they have to include high-vis paint. And if that's an issue that we have to think about investing in over time, I mean, that's one of the number one criticisms I get from people all over this city. And I know some of that, again, for the state maintained roads, that's an issue that we can't necessarily deal with. But if we can, there are too many new streets around here that are poorly marked. And to Ms. Schmera's question, Mr. Manager, what I heard from you is that City Council needs to give you guidance on what are our focus needs in relation to investing in repaving roads versus building sidewalks. Is this like a 50-50 question or 60-40 question for us to give you, or is this more of a binary? We really want to focus on roads, repaving roads versus sidewalks, or vice versa?
Sure. Mr. Winston, if you needed a recommendation from me now, I would say that sidewalks, lights, repaving, not necessarily in that order. But I think even from the conversation today, we're hearing sidewalks, lights, repaving, and that's what we would have started off with. But that's where we are.
And Mr. Winston, I think that question will be a little bit easier for you guys to understand when I get to the last slide of the next presentation, where it's talking about here's the capacity at this level, and you can talk about some of those needs.
Okay, Mr. Bakar, okay, go ahead.
I can answer your questions. So right in my alley, my wheelhouse. So your first question regarding complete streets, the initial construction of the streets, what matters the most. So if you have a good base, good intermediate layer, and a good surface, then the road will last regardless of whether there's curb and gutter, sidewalk, and all those pieces. You can have a country two-lane road with ditches on either side that will last a very long time and be structurally sound. Of course, you're not providing all the additional mobility benefits of the sidewalk and the stormwater benefits of curb and gutter. So in that sense, you know, how well the road's built doesn't necessarily depend on everything around it. Second one, recycled materials. So every street we resurface in the city of Charlotte, at least, I'd say 35 to 40% of the asphalt that's removed from the top of it is put back into asphalt that goes back on the road. That's one of the big selling points for asphalt in the industry, is it's a recycled product. One of the things we've been looking at with our partners is trying to increase that recycled asphalt percentage in the mix that goes down, so less of it it's not wasted. If you drive on 485 near Carolina Place Mall, you can see the mountain of asphalt there. There's a few other places around town. The asphalt companies use that, and we actually get a fairly significant discount on our resurfacing contract because we let them take it and reuse for our materials. The final question there on the high visibility paint. So every street we resurface that has pavement markings, part of that contract is to put down fresh, brand new markings. Challenges how long those pavement markings last with the age. Those aren't as long lasting as the surface of the asphalt. So it's a challenge to constantly remark and have those streets stay bright, visible markings, especially if we're not resurfacing for 10, 15, 20, 30 years or more. So.
Well, thank you. And I think we need to think about that painting cycle. It's dangerous, in some situations, especially in, I think, some of those outer parts of town. But even in the more dense parts of town, like in the urban centers, people really depend on those lines. And if they're not good, it's not a good situation. So, thanks.
Okay. Mr. Bakari?
Yeah, I feel like this is just yet another opportunity for us to be innovative and push the envelope. We need to reimagine our entire road system, and we need to do it right now. The near-term example is we need to figure out ways to be more nimble, bringing them up to the acceptable levels. And what you've seen right now is kind of the general way that CDOT goes about resurfacing and figuring out the kind of strategy there. But they've also been very nimble. But before the pandemic started, I introduced them to one of our homegrown local startups, GoodRoads.io. They did a pilot with them, and GoodRoads was able to take us from our previous model, at least which is still the majority of the current model, where we hire a company that is outfitted with all this, all these devices that take images of the roads, and they sweep the entire city so we know where we are. And we only really, I believe, if I remember correctly, get that back, like a view of that every 2 years. I mean, what GoodRoads did in the pilot, and again, they're a startup, so they weren't quite ready to scale, but the city was working with them, was they created these very compact and simple devices that were able to cheaply be mounted to anything, and they used artificial intelligence and imaging to be able to give you real-time analysis of, hey, this road has potholes that just popped up. And if we scaled something like that and put them on every CATS bus, every recycling and garbage truck, every city vehicle, every police car, every fire engine, every EMS unit, we would literally be covering in real time the entire city with imagery every day. And you just start with potholes. Then you can do many other things. You can look at congestion. You can have real-time views and so much. So that's just one small example of the bigger way we need to get more nimble. I just want to quickly read you something that came from the National League of Cities. NLC states that only 6% of U.S. major cities' long-range transportation master plans are weighing the challenges driverless cars will bring. Predictions are that cities will become more human-centered as technology continues to change our transportation. We're already seeing this with the continued rise of complete streets design across the U.S. It's important to understand that despite the continued efforts to get driverless cars on the streets, and even if they do become the majority, roads will still need to be designed to accommodate human drivers. By planning corridors for a more equal mix of modes, we position our transportation infrastructure in line with present-day trends while making it less challenging to accommodate what's ahead. That's a perfect example of us, and that was written in 2018. We have to get to work on that. I mean, we're Charlotte, and right now we're in the 94% of the nation that doesn't have this long-range view of what autonomous vehicles should be doing for our planning process. As a wise man once said, the end is the beginning, right? If we're not doing this now, we're never going to be prepared for this. So we should be having the big strategies right now to widen our streets and then be able to create narrower lanes that are dedicated for autonomous vehicles, that are more equipped to stay in those lanes than human-driven cars, and they can sense other vehicles, which increases the safety and enables us to expand for another mode while we continue to support what's here, and then reconfigure them to bypass, stops and lights and things like that wherever possible so they can keep moving. Again, it's a really big job. Everything from integrating the smart signals that we talked about earlier to completely changing our traffic laws. 5G infrastructure needs to be there. We need to figure out how sidewalks fit into this new world. The point is, it's a massive undertaking. That's why less than 6% of the nation even has things in their transportation long-term plans, let alone have started implementing it. There's no other way other than start right now. I've been pleading for years about this. Let's make this the budget cycle where we go ahead and start doing it. We have over 3 months before we've got to finish this. We cannot punt this another year. We don't have to solve everything, but 3 months is enough to scramble to build enough of a vision and a plan that we can bucket money and start working in this next fiscal year. If we wait another year, we're just going to be like everybody else, waiting, and someone's going to jump ahead, and we have the opportunity to be there. This is not some futuristic thing. This is something we should be doing over the next 3 months if we're serious about being a leading city and where this new tech is going.
All right, Mr. Phipps?
Yeah, I know. I know it was a reluctance to get into the politics of this Power Bill formula, but are we making any effort to use moral suasion to try to get back to the original formula with this Power Bill? I mean, I didn't notice that it was a part of our legislative agenda or not. I don't think it is, but are we just saying that we don't see that there's any optimism in that direction, or what?
I don't know that, Mr. Bakari, do you have a response for Mr. Phipps? Mr. Winston stepped out. Mr. Bakari?
I'm sorry, what was it?
I was asking, do we see much? Should we hold out any optimism that we would persuade our legislature to go back to the original formula to which the Power Bill was formulated to try to get that back, or should we? Maybe.
I think while that's not an impossibility, I think the more plausible scenario is we go back to a mix of not kind of like 50-50 or 60-40 feds to local. We go back and I have heard real potential interest in coming back to the table with a mix where not just do we go to the General Assembly for the ability to do things like whatever it's called, the vote, where people vote on bonds, but also then put in a mixture of money if the plan is something that they can buy into. And while we have a lot of work left to do, I'm getting a real sense that, maybe a more 50-50 or different between transit and transportation that has a heavy forward look on it, that would be where we could go. And I think while the Powell bill is possible in the near term, I think that might be a longer shot, but it's certainly possible that we can go back and make sure that that is also a component in the next budget cycle.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mr. Phipps, do you have any other questions?
Oh, no, that's it.
All right, Mr. Jones, what's next for us?
Thank you, Mayor. Now I believe we're going to have Jennifer Smith join Liz, and I don't have you down, Phil, but Phil's in the room, to talk a little bit about the Advanced Planning Fund projects. And again, if we go back a little bit, this was this opportunity for us to get better design on projects before we put them into the CIP. Mr. Winston's not in the room, but to some extent, the question that he asked earlier about understanding what's before us, having projects in this advanced planning fund provide us an opportunity not only to see what are some potential projects Liz, not projects, some potential opportunities down the road that could become projects, as well as making sure that we have good cost estimates. So Jennifer, do I turn this over to you? Or Liz?
I'm actually going to kick us off.
Okay.
Is someone loading the presentation? All right, awesome. If you'll bear with us for a moment while we get that on the screen, great, thank you. So again, I'm Liz Babson, the Director for the Charlotte Department of Transportation. I'm joined today by Jennifer Smith, who is our City Engineer and in the General Services Department. So we're going to update you on projects that are moving through that advanced planning and design program, and Jennifer and I are going to talk through that with you now. So before we get into project updates, and I turn it over to Jennifer, I do want to provide you with some background information on the program. Again, we've been before you for the last couple of years and talked in a lot more detail about this. So this is really just a reminder. In FY 2020, the Advanced Planning and Design Program was established, which created a funding source that allows us to complete planning and design up to 30% for projects that are identified for future bond funding. This was a really important step at that time, following some previous experience from the past bond program that resulted in some unanticipated costs and scope adjustments after the projects had already been programmed, which created some huge issues, as you might imagine. Projects that move into this program are at the top of our list of potential projects and represent our highest priorities based on that data-driven analysis that you've heard me talk about, considering safety, congestion, and connectivity. Projects move through that planning and early design process to evaluate their viability as a project going forward. And so cost estimates are determined at around 30% design, which again, and you heard the manager mention this in remarks earlier, really provides us a level of project detail so that costs can be budgeted with a higher degree of certainty. And so here's a map. You've seen this before. This is a map of our advanced planning transportation projects that are moving through that process right now. This list is in priority order with our number 1 and number 2 highest road improvements, followed by our number 1 and number 2 highest intersection improvements. Ray Road was also a 5th project that we added to that program because we did receive state bonus allocation funding, and so we needed capital dollars to put with that project to be able to take it to construction. And so before I turn it over to Jennifer, I want to leave you with a thought, and that is this advanced planning program has really allowed us to advance our 4 highest transportation improvement projects. But this is not all of the need that exists for us. This is just achieving some of those highest priority projects at this point. And in order to really achieve our mobility goals going forward, there are more needs across the city. So we're planning for growth of our city and constantly evaluating our transportation system by identifying future potential improvements. This list on the slide represents potential mobility improvement corridors that we have identified as high priority, again, based on the data that we have available of existing conditions. The list is alphabetized in order, does not define a project, but rather identifies a corridor for further study and evaluation so that feasibility work could be done to determine the scope and scale of potential projects that might move into a future advanced planning program. So this is not a complete list either. We have far more needs out there than what is shown here, but this list of corridors and mobility improvements does represent the priorities based on safety, congestion, and connectivity goals. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer.
Thank you again. I'm Jennifer Smith of the Department of General Services. You've seen this picture before, the draft 5-year plan from the FY22 budget. The 5 projects that Liz had shared with you that are in advanced planning are underlined in red, and the total bond, programmed here was $197 million. I'll talk to you about the cost and what we've gone through with advanced planning and what we're now estimating those costs to be. Oh, good, you got me. Moving forward, huh? So Bryant Farms Road Extension Phase 2. This extension of Bryant Farms is from Ray Road to Audrey Kell and expands upon the Phase 1 segment that was funded with the 18 and 20 bonds. Bryant Farms Road will provide additional connectivity and another east-west route for this area. It is estimated to cost $53 million if funded with the 24-26 bonds. This segment of Bryant Farms is 1.2 miles. We're planning a 2-lane road with multi-use path, intersection improvements at Ray Road, Tom Short, and Audrey Kell. The current estimate of the $53 million is quite a bit lower than what our range was of the $65 to $75 million. And the reason for this is that we had originally anticipated building 2 bridges as part of this segment. You can see there on the map, the bridge and the culvert now. So we've dropped 1 bridge and it's just changing over to a culvert. And also the amount of right-of-way and easement that we had originally anticipated that we would need has been significantly reduced as we went through the design phase. So that's the difference in the costs. Next slide, please. Robinson Church Road, the widening of Robinson Church Road from Harris to Hood is approximately 2.7 miles and has an estimated cost of $68 million if funded with the 26-28 bonds. We'll widen Robinson Church Road to a 3-lane street that allows for turn lanes and landscape medians. It will include curb and gutter, multi-use path, planting strips, and pedestrian refuge islands where needed. We'll construct a roundabout at Plot Road and do intersection improvements at W.T. Harris and Hood. The Eastway Shamrock Drive intersection, the modification of this intersection is to improve pedestrian accessibility and vehicular capacity by constructing new connector streets that allow the removal of the left turn lanes from the intersection, making the intersection more efficient for cars to move through more quickly. Also adding a multi-use path to Eastway Drive and adding buffered bike lanes, sidewalk, and a planting strip on Shamrock Drive that will tie into the Shamrock Drive streetscape project. Last year, I shared with you that the Eastway Shamrock intersection project was estimated at $39 million. We had already completed 30% plans. And the NCDOT had committed $8 million funding to that project. Over the past year, we've applied for CRTPO funds, that's the Charlotte Regional Transportation Planning Organization, and they have approved an additional contribution of $7.8 million, which drops the city contribution down to $23.2 million. The next intersection is Ashley Road, Tuckasegee, Freedom Drive. This intersection improvement will extend turn lanes and add pedestrian refuge islands, planting strips, multi-use path, and in some areas, just sidewalk and bike lanes. The estimated cost is $15 million when funded with the 26-28 bonds. And the last project was Ray Road widening. Liz had mentioned the state bonus allocation funding for this. This project includes widening of Ray Road from I-485 to just past Ballantyne Commons Parkway to mitigate traffic congestion. Estimated cost is $14 million. State bonus allocation funding is approximately 6.67, and the city contribution is then 7.3 million. This chart is just sharing with you what we had predicted our cost or estimated our cost to be last year this time, and what I had just shared the numbers with you today. We had estimated a total of we have a total estimated cost of $189 million, but the city bond contribution would be down to 166.5 with state contributions and CRTPO, well, all that state contributions, but state funding. The FY22 draft budget bond plan showed a contribution of $197 million, so we've dropped that number quite a bit. I do want to share with you that we have another opportunity to reduce the city funding even a little bit more. We submitted for CRTPO funding on Robinson Church Road. And the way we were able to get the funding is by splitting this project into 2 phases. Phase 1, which is shown here, that was Harris Boulevard to Plot. Phase 2 would be Plot to Hood. The Phase 1 project scores very high for congestion and safety mitigation, and we've been approved for $6.2 million in additional CRTPO funding. There's a bit of a catch, though. We would need to move some of the funding up for Robinson Church Road to the 2024 bond for the Phase 1 to capitalize on that $6.2 million. The chart here shows the original funding plan in 26 and 28 for that roadway. And then it also shows the split, if we were going to try and use the 6.2, how much money we would need to move up to 2024, assuming that we would fund Phase 1 in 2024 and 2026, and Phase 2 would be funded in 26 and 28. The city contribution would then be $58.8 million that we would need. And that's the end of mine. Questions?
Mr. Winston?
This is great. I do think, this advanced planning fund, I think, it's something, it's a lemonade story, right? We took lemons and we turned it into lemonade. So I think this is something we should all be proud of. My question is, everything looks great. It's in relation to the actual, you mentioned the Ray Road widening project that is intended to decrease congestion. I'd just like to know how we believe that this design, maybe that we can talk about this offline later on, how this will actually decrease congestion. I'm not necessarily seeing that. Everything else, all the other ones, they seem very innovative, traffic circles, really changing the direction of Eastway and Shamrock, which is problematic. I'm familiar with this Ray Road section of road, and also how are we kind of thinking about that in relation to also making that more pedestrian-centric, so where cars and people can interact. Again, I see a lot of that on all the other designs. I don't see any of that on this, so I just, maybe again, like I said, maybe we go over the actual project later on.
Okay. All right. Mr. Newton?
Yes, ma'am. I wanted to thank staff for all their hard work on this. What stands out to me is, I see that we're on this, the Robinson Church Road funding slide. I think the slide before this had shown that of the projects being considered, this is the one where the expense has and likely will continue to increase over time. And so I really think jumping on this opportunity to receive the CARTPO funds is not just going to allow this much needed project to move forward sooner, but at the same time is going to save us millions. And I wanted to point that out.
Ms. Johnson, sorry.
That's okay. Ms. Johnson? Couldn't get water fast enough. Ms. Johnson?
I just need to lower my hand, I'm sorry.
Okay, all right. Any other questions on this section? Mr. Bakari?
Hold hand.
Okay, Mr. Phipps?
Yeah, I thought that, I don't know, in previous presentations, I thought work on farm to market roads was going to be like a lower priority. I mean, is the fact that this one is being done, is it because it meets these other criterias of congestion and things like that?
Yes, sir. I don't have the data in front of me. We presented that to you all last year, but from what I recall, it was a crash pattern, as well as we do not have sidewalk or bicycle facilities at all in this location, and street lights don't exist either. So this project delivers on all of those.
Thank you.
All right, are there Mr. Ryan, Mr. Bergman, sorry.
One thing I just did want to point out to City Council is we did include at the back of your advanced planning presentation what we've called the blue and yellows over the last few years, where it's all of our general CIP projects that are in construction or design at this point. And if you want to take a look at that in your spare time, if you send any questions or clarifications you'd like, we'll treat that as part of the Q&A packet.
Is that so that we can move on to the 2022 and the 2028 important part of our bond strategy and priorities discussion? So
So I would definitely like to introduce this, Mayor. So once again, Mr. Bergman has this interactive model. No, I'm just messing with you. So, no, I just, last time, Ryan, I introduced the topic, and I said, there's this interactive model. He leaned over to me and he said, it's not, it's a spreadsheet. So, here's an opportunity for, as Ryan spoke about earlier, some choices that the council can make related to this additional capacity. So, Ryan.
Sure, thank you, Mr. Jones, and we'll give it a second to get that one loaded up here. And so while we get it loaded up, this is just about 8 slides of content, but I'll move really quick because a few of it is really just a summary of what we've heard so far to get you to the big slide where we do have some capacity based on our current financing structure and what we may, what you guys may want to do with it. It's so uninteractive this year that it's not even on the screen. Give us one more second. We're just trying to get it so I have control. Okay. So this is what I just mentioned. We'll just summarize what we talked about earlier today, and then we'll get to the actual scenarios. So a quick state funding update that was mentioned throughout the presentations. Robinson Church Road has some CARTPO funds available. We still have $6.7 million in a state bonus allocation for Ray Road. And then we certainly talked about the Powellville Street resurfacing reduction that we're trying to plan on. So quick summary again, but it's kind of a repeat of what Jennifer talked about. But I guess generally what I would say is that we've received mostly good news from our advanced planning fund. I think it's a testament to the new process. I'd also say, though, that because the roads are the primary source of the savings, those are in the 24, 26, and 28 bond cycles. So we're really trying to plan on what the next 4 bond cycles look like. But of course, the next bond cycle, which is 2022, is most important for City Council discussion because that's the one that you would actually vote to put in front of the voters in November. So the starting point for this is the 4-bond plan that was included in the budget last year. You didn't formally approve anything on this last year, but we did try to incorporate all of the feedback, discussions that this council has had over the last couple of years, just to put it out there. And, that's why you see some of the things that you're talking about today, we did try to proactively increase, such as sidewalks more than tripling, Vision Zero doubling, bicycle facilities doubling. And so the funding for those programs wouldn't take effect until this upcoming budget if you continue on that path. So I call these scenarios, but really I just am going to show our current bond schedule 2 different ways, incorporating everything we've heard today. And the point of differential between the two is just around Robinson Church Road, which Jennifer mentioned. Originally, it was going to be planned for 26 and 28. We have this state CARTPO opportunity to move it up and phase it. So I'll just show both of those scenarios. But let me talk for a minute about the bottom box there and the $225 million in capacity. So we talked earlier about the 37 million in new funds. 225 is assuming that the majority, or 27 million of it, would go towards bonds. Really, that 225 could become 234 if that's council's prerogative, but I did mention some of the COPS-related needs earlier. I won't repeat them around fire stations, but one that I didn't mention is we actually fund some of our CAP goals through COPS because they're building-related. So last year in COPS, we had 4 million for building-related CAP, so that included charging stations, where I'll quote Sarah Hazel, where we are currently have about 40% of the charging stations in the city of Charlotte. We've also done some pretty neat things around solar and rooftop solar on our buildings, including at the government center, that we'll see start to come to fruition. So when we say that a portion of that new capacity would go towards COPS, it doesn't just mean only build something that replaces an old building by any means. In fact, it's mostly for things such as new fire stations or some of the CAP goals, and also some of the technology that we will spend quite a bit of time talking about at the next budget workshop. So just to try to make my next couple of slides a little bit easier to read without going to size 4 font, I just wanted to handle these ones all in a bucket. So what I would call these are the projects and programs where we really don't have a lot of flexibility on. And it's really in 2 buckets. One are the economic development agreements that have already been made by City Council. So that's Ballantyne, the Innovation District, Centene. And then it's the programs that really we need to keep operating our transportation system, such as the traffic control devices and the intelligent transportation systems, and then our bridge program, which has some federal requirements around it. So I just put these in one bucket to show that this amount of funding is more or less locked in. But beyond that, I'll show this 2 different ways, a scenario A and a scenario B. So construct Robinson Church Road in this scenario stays with that 26 and 28 timeline. So just trying to help you guys read this a little bit, because I know it's a lot. 225 million is the starting capacity at the top for each bond cycle. And then as you go down, the only changes that will be in here are the changes that you've heard about today. So it's the advanced planning projects that were mentioned, it's the new capacity. And so what this is a starting point for City Council. But what I do want to emphasize is that City Council is also able to change anything in there. It's not necessarily just about the 25 million. City Council, of course, until you approve an actual budget and a bond referendum for 2022, has flexibility for everything within those blocks, with the limited exception of some of those programs I just mentioned. So you'll see that there is capacity in all 4 bonds here. However, you will see at the bottom street resurfacing when we talk about what we hope is a temporary gap in some of our street resurfacing funding. So I showed it 2 ways. I showed just replacing the lost revenue for the 2 years that the bond covers would be about 13.6 million. If you went further to try to get to a 30-year schedule, you would go to 19.6 million. I will say what I said earlier, however, that we do to try to tackle that issue in a couple of different ways and not just in capital funding. And so then moving on to scenario B, which is what I'll leave it on, is the only change from A to B here is Robinson Church Road, which I highlighted, moving it up a little bit. So the state funds not only reduce the project by their amount, but it also allows to do a little bit more, a little bit earlier. And since there's inflation costs built into all these projects, it does become even cheaper. So in this scenario, you'll have 25 million all the way up to 46 million prior to doing anything with street resurfacing. And so I guess what I would say before turning it over is, not just during budget workshops, also during council meetings, we're constantly trying to collect your priorities and your information so that when the manager produces a proposed budget, it tries to take as much as possible in mind. So we've heard you loud and clear on some of the things that you've said prior today around sidewalks and street lighting and things of that nature. But this is really just a slide to look at for City Council to talk about capacity. They can talk about the projects themselves and what's appropriate, or anything else you may want to talk about, and it'll help us build our starting point of the proposed budget. So the last slide just says questions, so I'll actually just go ahead and leave it here.
And I'll just add one thing, and then I'll turn it over to you, Mr. Driggs, in terms of, I guess, questions that come up. To Ryan's point, if you start off with sidewalks, if we had the 2020 bond, if we had a column there that showed the 2020 bond, you would show how much we added more to sidewalks, how we added more to Vision Zero, how we added more to, I believe, the Connect Bicycle facilities. And that was all based on the feedback you gave us over the previous year. And then again, while you didn't vote on this last year, it was part of the budget presentation, so none of this should be new. We think that we were going down the right track, and I will tell you right now, if you said we don't want to do anything other than receive this information, it's fine. It's not the expectation that something has to be, done today, but if there's something that you suggested we were so far off, that would be good to know. So with that said, Mr. Driggs, I think you have Mr. Newton, unless you want to do something first.
Well, if Mr. Newton had his hand up, by all means. Matt?
Thanks, Ed.
Yeah.
I just got kicked off the call here a moment ago, so I don't know if I missed anything, but I did want to comment on the scenario A versus scenario B question. Certainly, I'm a proponent of the Robinson Church Road project. I do think that scenario B, regardless, is still preferable, because when we look at the remaining capacities for our 2024 and 2026 bonds, we might find ourselves behind by roughly 14 million. But then when you look at the 23 million increase on the 2028 bond cycle, we have a net gain of 9. Certainly over time, as the last presentation illustrated, the project is going to continue to become more and more expensive. So I think it's going to continue to eat into the remaining capacity. And if we were to pursue scenario A, we would find ourselves a little further behind because of that. So I think that the cost savings here is an important point to make. And then again, too, as we talk about the street lighting improvements needed within our city, and then also the sidewalk improvements needed within our city, I wanted to point out that Robinson Church corridor falls in both of those categories. So when we look at the maps that were provided to us earlier, just take note of the fact that Robinson Church corridor is on both of those maps, and would likewise be addressed through this project, thereby freeing up the opportunity for other locations throughout the city to be addressed. So just wanted to make those points to underscore my support for scenario B.
So if I may,
Yes, Mr. Driggs,
Yeah.
my apologies.
so the first column here, is that the same as the numbers we were looking at last year when we talked about CIP?
The only thing that, let's see.
Your resurfaced streets.
Ray Road went up a little bit. That was the one that went up a little bit, the 1.3 million. Otherwise, everything would be the same as last year.
Including resurfaced streets?
Yes.
So that number for resurfaced streets, along with an operating budget adjustment, right, replaces the Powell bill funds?
No, the Powell bill funds would have to be in addition to the 8 million that was already built in.
Right, so the 8 million doesn't include anything to address the Powell bill.
Correct.
See, what I think would be helpful here for us, and colleagues, tell me if you agree, is I think what you've created here is a framework, right? And a lot of these numbers are pretty solid for one reason or another. But based on the conversation we had, if we had a list of possible kind of allocations for the remaining capacity, taking on board what you've just told us and what you know from our reactions, I think it'd be easier to talk from that than for us to just try in a vacuum to kind of say, okay, how about 5 million for this, or what about 10 million for that? And for example, on the resurfacing, you could say, all right, from your 25 and these different amounts, if you allocated these numbers, you would be back at 25 years, which we know is more than replacement, right? So if you just put the Powell bill money in there, we're at 35 years. So maybe give us a schedule to talk from, and I'm sure there will be suggestions as to what to be on that list, but I do think we need to have everybody's idea pulled together so that we can then kind of, to talk among ourselves about prioritizing. Is the question for my district, is that Bryant Farms Road extension timeline the same as before? Like, are we still on the same schedule for Bryant Farms that we were?
Yes.
All right. So that's just my general suggestion. I think otherwise these numbers are okay. I've made my point about the weight of the affordable housing commitment, particularly in conjunction with corridor investments and other things, not to diminish the importance of that. But we're facing some tough choices here, and it's going to come down to a revenue conversation. And that's the thing I'm worried about, frankly. So anyway, if you could give us a little more to work from on the possible allocations, I think that would be helpful. Thank you.
I just want to make sure that your request is where we have these local projects that we 100% fund, give us some ideas of different choices among them, like sidewalks, street resurfacing, those related projects? Is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying in general is we've pointed now to sidewalks and some of those issues. I suggested that we need to work on a policy about a steady state, for those needs. But for this exercise, if staff came to us and said, okay, you could do this, these amounts, and that would get you such and such. You could do this for sidewalks, for the resurfacing, for other initiatives that people want to offer. And then we would be able to do a Chinese menu from that instead of just having everybody wing out a number.
Yeah, and I mean, we can put together in the Q&A packet, there's a lot of different scenarios around Powell bill, more miles, sidewalks, things like that. So we can put options out there.
Yeah. I like the idea of doing that and having everybody feed into it. I also think that it would be helpful to kind of give some categories and connections between this entire list when you do that. It's like, what impacts transportation? What impacts economic development? What impacts housing in some categories? But I like the idea, so let's figure out how to do
You
it.
can classify it that way.
Okay. All right. I have Mr. Winston, Mr. Newton, and Mr. Graham.
Thank you. Finance is not necessarily my strong suit, but I think I'm following what Mr. Dre was saying.
There's a class, they have it on Old Course.
But I'm reading the numbers, and I did a little math here, and scenario A, it looks like the total cost are $9.2 million more than scenario B. And the capacity of scenario A, the remaining capacity is about $9.2 million less in scenario A than scenario B. So I don't know how much of being if our number one responsibility is being good stewards of taxpayer dollars, I don't even see how we would consider scenario A. That's just this council member's input.
Yeah, I guess I'd say the availability of state dollars is certainly a heavy driver. And then anytime we're able to do a bigger transportation project a little bit sooner, you don't have to build the 2 years of inflation on the project, which is why it's cheaper.
Right. Anything else, Mr. Winston?
I'm reading it correctly?
Yes, you're reading it correctly. All right. So then we'll go to Mr. Newton. I'm sorry. All right, I was just, Miss Ajmira, and then we'll come to you, Mr. Newton. Although you look just great today.
He's not on deck.
He's not on deck at all. I can disconnect. Okay, Mr. Newton. All right, so Miss Ajmira.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Ryan, can we do a one-on-one on this? I would like to go over both of these scenarios with you before I provide my feedback, because I have so many questions and I don't want to take up everyone else's time. I got like 50 questions, so I would just rather have one-on-one and provide my feedback.
Absolutely.
I think that's a great idea. Is there any one or two, Ms. Ajmira, that you think are really important for all of us to begin to think about?
Well, some of the details that Mr. Driggs has asked for, but then also looking at all the priorities, everything that council members have raised so far, how does it all fit into both scenarios, right? I know we talked about street payments, we talked about sidewalks, we talked about street lights. I know the conversation will come up around salary increase, and I know this is just the capital projects we are talking about, but I also want to understand the capacity. So I have a lot of questions.
Okay. All right, Mr. Bergman, you've got that. Mr. Graham.
I guess this is also an appropriate time to start talking about the affordable housing as well. And I know we talked about, notwithstanding the comments that Mr. Driggs made, about even in the future that $50 million may not be enough. And so I would hope that the council, as we begin to look at this bond cycle, and certainly as we pivot to 2024, that we have a conversation about that. I think after 20 years is probably time that we review the Housing Trust Fund in terms of how those dollars are being utilized. And it does not go unnoticed about what you said, Mr. Driggs. I get it. I think we got to do both.
Yeah, I would say, is Mr. Graham is complete. We have a commission that we put up as a part of the 2040 plan, and they're beginning to have their discussions. And I think that there are different ways to go. We have to decide. It's either the city puts up this money, we could have more regulatory requirements for people to do more in and of itself. We could actually try to figure out how to make our incentives for, it's just, we can't diminish the number that we're doing. We just have to figure out, is there more methodologies and more ways to fund it or fund it differently? That's the discussion that I was trying to, say, that I think it's a fair discussion as long as we don't step backwards, we move forward, but we have other ways to get it done. And that's really a big council question of, what policies are we willing to say we've invested, it's improved the community, it's provided us opportunities for people to live and work in our city, workforce housing particularly, and how do we deal with this? And what I don't see on this list, the recommendations from the joint study that was done by Kathy Bassant and Gene Woods at all on this. And so I don't know whether there's a cost impact there. So we've got a lot of things to do with this. It's just, I don't see us stepping back from what we're doing. I think if there's another way to do it, then we need to figure that out. And I see 3 hands go up. Mr. Jones, Mr. Graham, and Mr. Driggs.
And just like Councilmember Ajmira would like to probably get with the manager and Ryan just to kind of talk what if, right? I don't want to take up the council members' time now.
Yeah, the what ifs are important.
It's the what ifs.
So, want to go first?
Thank you.
Go ahead.
So I think I could be helpful with some of the conversations that we're having today, just by using sidewalks for the example. And Liz, bail me out a little bit. So even with this $50 million proposed for sidewalks, we carved out 20% because we said there were some areas, like in South Charlotte, in the Far East, that may not have scored high enough to be a part of, getting some sidewalks. So that's part of the benefit of, this 50 million. So as you've seen a lot of maps today, maybe as council talks amongst yourselves, there may be a different way of looking at some of these additional funds that maybe you wanted in particular areas because there's a need. There's some more data you asked for with maps, as Ms. Johnson asked, dealing with, some of the road network and, what's fair, good. So I think we can give you more data so that you can make better decisions or more informed decisions. And even to the point of what you just said, Mr. Graham, I do think it's, we should council should continuously look at the framework around housing to see how we can better deploy those dollars. So we started off by just trying to give you everything that we have. And what I'm hearing is maybe you need a little bit more, a little bit more before you can make decisions that would be good decisions, at least background data.
Mr. Driggs.
Thank you. So Ms. Babson, Elm Lane, okay, sidewalk, top of the list. On the housing thing, I want to point out, we have a policy, a bonus incentive, right? And no one did it. And it said you can have twice as much density if you make it affordable. The terms of that thing were not workable. So what I'm proposing is non-monetary means of incenting the creation of housing. And we can ask ourselves, for example, whether all the requirements related to the 2040 plan need to be imposed on affordable housing developments, or whether for that small fraction of housing that will be affordable, we could afford to settle for less. The developers tell us that 30% of their cost is related to government. So do we have a fast track, for example, for processing applications? And do we relax some of the open space requirements or some other things in order to ease the cost of compliance? Because those sidewalks, those planting strips, all of that, in the context of the need for housing, it's a bit of a luxury, frankly. Even though it's what we want for our city, it wouldn't cost us much in the locations where the housing is affordable to ease up on those requirements. We need to get to a place where the incentives that we offer are enough to induce private equity to create this housing and ease the strain on public money. Because otherwise, the danger in my mind is we get to a point where we have to talk about more revenue. And if we're going to go out and say it takes a property tax increase to keep doing all of the things that we must do and to defend our affordable housing investments, that's not a good place, because that property tax hits a lot of the same people that we're trying to help. So I'm hoping that we can avoid reaching that point where people see a hard choice between sidewalks and housing, and for one, program our fundamental infrastructure in such a way that we have a path forward, and then attack the housing issue by means other than just money.
I think that you're thinking the next two chairs, both of whom you know well, Kim Graham and Justin Harlow, have suggested that there be an investors roundtable discussion around affordable housing, because I don't want to say this, even as we go forward, it's growing. And what should we be doing, and asking the investors what they would do. That would be one of the things that they were talking about. But we also went to Austin, and what we found out, where there was the train going and new development, they regulated 60%, 10% units, 60% and above. And that was a regulation. And sometimes when we're paying for that train or whatever, if it happens, we're creating that value. And the opportunity to regain that in a public, a need that's so great for this community, by asking people to, it's not 30% maybe, but what are your profits at some point? We have to ask that and say, well, can you help us in that regard too? And not just make it philanthropy, but part of a business plan. And that's the kind of thing that I think we have to start looking at.
So, Mayor, quickly to that, there is a thing called a TIF, not a TIG, which basically does impose a surcharge along, say, an area like the area served by the transit corridor. Because I agree with you. I think the Blue Line, for example, created a huge amount of wealth for other people while we were paying for the train. So there ought to be a way to claw some of that back. Maybe you bank some land for affordable housing early. But
But we don't have any more money. See, we have to figure out these
I know.
incentives that don't work out, that we have to go buy land that's selling it. I mean, the numbers are astounding now in Charlotte. So someplace we have to figure this out, and I think you're right on target. Mr. Graham?
One
is
question,
up.
then I'm going to have to excuse myself. So when and how do we have this conversation as relates to the budget? I mean, the conversation we were having is spot on.
Well, I just thought that the NEST committee would be able to come back
Yeah.
and talk about that in the context of the 2040 plan and recommendations that they would make. And both, I think they're very excited. They've had one meeting, and as they say, there are a lot of passions in the room. So we got to start moving that towards some recommendations. But those were I really think that Ms. Watlington and I are both encouraging communication among the people that make these things happen. And so that's why the developer roundtable was discussed, as well as neighborhood engagement. Last night, the West Side Land Trust, she reprimanded me for saying that we ought to make people, the homeowners, do things. And she said, it's the system that's the problem and not the homeowners. And I was like, okay, I got that one. I understood it very well. So this conversation needs to be done with that NEST committee, I believe. And so getting that out is important. All right. Mr. Jones, Mr. Bergman, anything else?
That's all that we have for you.
That's a lot.
Shucks.
So thank you. Thank you. So we are going to adjourn this meeting. Thank you, everyone, for your attention, and particularly, there are a lot of cities that we visit that we don't see the kind of team work being done. A finance officer is kind of like to the budget person saying, well, that's your job. But that's not us. And the operational units coming together and understanding every part of it, I just want to commend the team for the work that you do and the collaborations and the communication that we have. And with that, this meeting is adjourned. Bye.